As early as 2011, peer-reviewed medical journals were documenting dermal filler migrating centimetres from the original injection site, while the brochures sitting in clinic waiting rooms still described it as fully reversible and naturally absorbed. What science knew and what women were told were not always the same thing. You are standing at a mirror in a light that is still deciding whether to be morning. It might be winter, the bathroom is quiet, the rest of the house is asleep, or the apartment is empty, or the hotel room holds only the sound of a city you don't live in. Whatever the case, you are alone with your face, and you're looking at it the way you sometimes do. Not the quick glance before leaving, but the longer, slower kind of looking that only happens when no one is watching. There is something you have been thinking about. You may have been thinking about it for months or years, or perhaps only since a photograph caught you at an angle you didn't expect. It is not a dramatic thought. It is quiet, and it lives in the space between what you see and what you had imagined you looked like. This is a story about that thought, about what it leads to and what it doesn't, about a time when a particular promise was being made to women all over the world, a small, elegant, 30-minute promise, and about what the medical literature was quietly noting in the background while those promises were being made. It is not a frightening story. It is a slow one. Come in close, find somewhere comfortable, and let this be the thing that carries you through the night. If you enjoy listening to stories like this, subscribe. I post new ones every week. The thought rarely arrives fully formed. It begins as something much smaller, a flicker, a catch, a moment of slight dislocation. You see a photograph taken from the wrong angle, and something in you goes still. You notice, in the light of a certain afternoon, that a line has deepened, or a shadow has settled somewhere it didn't used to settle. You catch your reflection in a shop window, and for just a second, the face looking back is not quite the face you had been carrying around in your mind all these years. There is a gap between the face you imagine yourself to have and the face the world is seeing, and on most days you don't notice the gap. On certain days, you do. These moments pass, you put the phone down, you step out of the light, you move on with the day, because the day requires it, and because standing at the window of a pharmacy in the middle of an afternoon is not where the thought is welcome. But the thought stays. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't make demands. It simply waits, in the back of the mind, patient as a stone at the bottom of a stream. Researchers who study body image have spent decades trying to understand this particular species of thought, the one that lives in the mirror, the one that speaks in the quiet morning, the one that says not quite. What they have found is that it is not vanity, or not primarily vanity, and it is not weakness. It is something far more complicated than either of those words can hold. It is the gap between the face we present to the world and the story we tell ourselves about who we are, a gap that exists in some form in an astonishing proportion of women across almost every culture that has been studied. The psychologist Philippa Diedrichs, whose work at the Centre for Appearance Research in Bristol has tracked body image across cultures and generations, has argued that body dissatisfaction is so widespread in contemporary Western culture that it has become almost invisible, a background noise so constant we no longer hear it as noise. It is simply the air. Women learn to breathe it from childhood, and by the time they are adults, most of them have been breathing it so long they cannot easily separate it from their own thoughts. It has become interior. It presents as the voice of reason or of honest self-assessment, rather than as what it actually is, the internalized output of a culture that has always had very specific opinions about what female faces should look like and how women should respond when theirs fall short. The face in the mirror is the place where those opinions land. The mirror is not a neutral object. It is the instrument through which a woman negotiates between what she is and what she has been taught she should be, and that negotiation has been going on in most women's lives for as long as they can remember. You're standing at the mirror and the thought says, something here could be different. And this thought, this specific, quiet, unalarming thought, has led, in the early decades of the 21st century, to an enormous number of decisions. It has led women into consultation rooms and into chairs and into conversations with practitioners holding needles and out again into the world with faces that look like themselves, but, and this is the word that appears again and again in the accounts women give of why they made the choice, refreshed. Here is where the story becomes specific, because this is not a story about all the ways a face can change, or all the reasons a woman might want it to. This is a story about one particular answer to that thought, an answer that was offered in the first 2 decades of the 21st century with a kind of confident ease that the science had not quite caught up to. An answer that was described in the language of restoration rather than transformation, of enhancement rather than alteration, of a brief intervention with a temporary product in a temporary body, experiencing temporary dissatisfaction with a temporary state of things. The answer was a needle, a clear gel, a consultation that lasted 20 minutes, a recovery that was said to last a weekend at most, a result that was described in clinics from London to Los Angeles to Seoul as natural, temporary, and safe. In most cases, in most clinics, for most women, the word natural was true. The word temporary was true mostly. The word safe was more complicated than anyone said. But we are getting ahead of the story. The story begins earlier than 2011. It begins with the mirror, and with the long human history of what women have done when they stood in front of one and felt the pull of that particular thought. The impulse to alter the face is ancient. Archaeologists have found evidence of cosmetic preparation in graves dating to 40,000 years before the Common Era. Ochre ground to powder, shells used as containers, substances that stained and smoothed and changed. The ancient Egyptians used coal and henna and ground malachite, not merely as decoration but as protection. The coal around the eyes was antimicrobial, and the green malachite paste had medicinal properties that its users had discovered empirically over generations. The cosmetic and the therapeutic were not, for much of human history, separated. Greek and Roman women whitened their skin with lead, at enormous cost to their health, because the cultural ideal of the time read paleness as refinement and refinement as worth. Medieval European women plucked their hairlines to lengthen their foreheads, because the ideal of the era was a high, smooth brow, an ideal so specific, so culturally particular, that it is difficult to recover from the other side of it. Women endured the pain of plucking and the slowness of the process because the social reward for the result was real. None of this was vanity in the shallow sense. All of it was a negotiation with the world, with what the world rewarded and what it withheld, and what a woman understood about her own position within it. The historian Kathy Peace, in her landmark study of beauty culture in America, traces the way cosmetic practice has always been entangled with questions of identity, aspiration, and social legibility. The woman who changes her face is not, Peace argues, simply changing her face. She's entering a conversation about who she's allowed to be, about which doors open to which faces, about which spaces are available to which women, about the unspoken currencies of appearance that have always circulated alongside the official ones. The currency has changed form across the centuries. It has been about paleness and darkness, about fullness and thinness, about youth and age, about symmetry and asymmetry, about the particular combination of features that the dominant culture of a given moment has decided to reward. But the fact of the currency has remained constant. A woman's appearance has always been legible as a kind of social text, one that others read and respond to, one that the woman herself is aware of being read. You know this, in some way, even if you have never put it into words. You know that the thought in the mirror is not really about the mirror. It is about the meeting next week, and the way a certain colleague looks at you, and the photograph from 10 years ago that you keep returning to, and the way your mother used to touch her own face when she thought no one was watching. It is about the accumulation of small communications from the world around you, received over a lifetime, about what your face means and what faces like yours are supposed to be. The thought has roots, it always does. And so when dermal fillers emerged as a genuine, accessible option, not surgery, not the long recovery or the significant cost or the social revelation of a face that looked visibly different, something in the conversation changed. Here was a treatment that answered the thought without requiring the kind of commitment the thought had always previously demanded. Here was a needle, a lunch break, a face that looked like yours, but somehow, and this was the word that appeared in clinic marketing and in magazine profiles, and in the language of women talking to each other, refreshed. Refreshed. Not changed. Not altered. Not different. Refreshed. As if the face had simply been reminded of something it already knew. The marketing was careful, and it was good, and it understood something true about the way women experienced the thought in the mirror. The thought is rarely I want to look like someone else. It is more often I want to look like myself, the self I carry around in my imagination, the self from a few years ago, the self I am when I'm not tired, or sad, or caught in a bad light. The filler clinic did not offer transformation, it offered restoration. That framing was powerful. It was in many ways kind. It gave women permission to want something without framing the wanting as a rejection of themselves. It made the treatment feel coherent with the idea of self-care rather than opposed to the idea of self-acceptance, and that coherence was important because by the 2000s, the language of self-care had become so central to the way women talked about their own well-being that any beauty treatment framed within it had an enormous advantage. The thought in the mirror could now be answered without guilt. The choice could be framed as a form of maintenance, like going to the gym or getting a good haircut, something you did for yourself because you valued yourself, rather than something you did because the world had told you your face was inadequate. The reframing was imperfect, but it was powerful, and it allowed a great many women to make a decision they might otherwise have been ambivalent about. But the reframing rested on a set of assumptions about how the product behaved inside the body, assumptions that the clinical literature, by 2011, was beginning to quietly complicate. And you, standing at the mirror in the early light, in the quiet before the day begins, could not have known that. Nobody told you. Nobody told most of the women who sat down in those clean, well-lit rooms and said yes. The thought in the mirror waits. The day is about to begin. Something in you is still deciding. And somewhere, in the filing cabinet of a medical journal published in 2009 and updated through subsequent years, a researcher is writing a sentence that will take years to reach the women it concerns most. The gap between those two rooms, the mirror room and the journal room, is the gap this story tries to cross. It is not a dramatic gap, in the sense that dramas usually require. It is a quiet one. The kind of gap that opens in the space between professional knowledge and ordinary experience, between what is known in the specialized literature and what is communicated to the people who are affected by it. That gap has a shape and a history and a set of consequences, and understanding it is part of understanding why so many women, in so many cities, in so many clinics, found themselves somewhere they had not entirely planned to be. The thought in the mirror waits for all of us, eventually. What matters is the kind of room we walk into when we decide to answer it. There is something specific about the morning mirror that is worth staying with a little longer, because it is the site at which most of this story begins for most of the women who have been part of it. The morning mirror is a private space. Unlike the photographs on social media or the judgments implied by the gaze of others, the encounter with the mirror in the early morning is one that the woman has only with herself, a reckoning that is not witnessed, not performed, not shaped by the presence of anyone whose opinion she is managing. It is the closest thing most people have to a direct, unmediated relationship with their own appearance. And yet even the private mirror is not truly private. The woman who stands at the mirror in the morning is not entirely alone. She carries with her the accumulated opinions that have been formed about faces, by the culture, by the specific people in her life who have commented on her appearance, by the advertising images she has absorbed since childhood, by the filters and adjustments that have become the standard presentation of faces in the digital environments she inhabits. All of those presences are in the mirror with her, shaping the quality of her attention and the judgment that emerges from it. This is what researchers mean when they describe appearance-related cognitions as egosyntonic, as thoughts that feel like they come from the self, rather than from outside it. The woman at the mirror experiences her evaluative thoughts about her own face as her own thoughts, her own observations, her own assessments. She does not typically experience them as the output of a cultural program that has been running in her since early childhood. The program is too deeply installed to feel like a program. It feels like perception. The clinical and philosophical work of distinguishing the authentic thought from the installed program is part of what makes the mirror encounter genuinely complicated. It is not simply a matter of thinking better thoughts or of refusing to accept critical ones. It is a matter of developing the capacity to notice which thoughts are genuinely one's own, rooted in the specific person's actual values and actual relationships with her own body, and which are outputs of a system that the person did not design and has not fully examined. This distinction is not always available. Many women who have done significant work around their own body image describe a long period in which every critical thought about their appearance felt like a genuine perception of something real, rather than a cultural transmission of a standard they had not chosen. The shift toward being able to hold the thought at enough distance to examine it, to ask where it came from, whose values it expresses, what it would mean if it were set aside, is a shift that typically happens slowly, and that is not permanent once achieved. The mirror will be there tomorrow morning, and the morning after. The thought may still come. What changes is not the thought's arrival, but the relationship to it. Before there was hyaluronic acid, there was paraffin. The history of injecting substances into the human face is longer than most people know, and it begins not in the clean clinical offices of the 21st century, but in the early 20th, in a moment when the very idea of reshaping the body with a needle was still new enough to feel like magic, or like danger, or sometimes like both at once. The story of that beginning is worth knowing, not because it directly caused what happened in the 2000s, but because it established a pattern, a particular shape of promise, and a particular shape of consequence, that repeated itself across more than a century. In the 1890s and into the early 1900s, paraffin wax was being injected into faces across Europe and America. The technique was first described in 1899 by a Viennese physician, Robert Gersony, who used it to replace a patient's testicle after surgical removal. He quickly recognized the cosmetic applications and began using it in the face. The results initially were considered remarkable. The wax was warm and fluid when injected, and it hardened at body temperature into a substance that mimicked the volume of natural tissue. Photographs from the era show faces that had been, in the language of the day, corrected, brought back from some departure from the norm that the patient and their doctor had agreed was a problem worth solving. One of the most common applications was for the nose, specifically the nose affected by syphilis, which in advanced stages of the disease could collapse the nasal bridge, leaving what was called a saddle nose. The syphilitic nose carried a social weight in that period that went far beyond the physical. Syphilis was legible on the face, and a face that bore its mark was a face that announced a history. The paraffin injection offered something that went deeper than aesthetics. It offered concealment, and therefore a kind of freedom, the freedom to move through the world without your face testifying against you. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. The very first widely used injectable cosmetic treatment was motivated, at least in part, by the desire to pass, to present a face that didn't carry a story the world would use against you. The need that the treatment answered was not primarily aesthetic. It was social, and it was urgent, and it was real. The women and men who sought it were not being frivolous. They were trying to survive in a world that made judgments about them based on what their faces revealed. The problem with paraffin was that it moved. Over time, and sometimes very quickly, the wax migrated through the tissue. It formed hard nodules called paraffinomas, dense fibrous masses that the body built around the foreign substance in an attempt to contain it. It travelled to places it had not been put. In some cases it moved into the eye socket. In others, it descended along the jawline, collecting in lumps that were disfiguring in ways far more visible than what the injection had originally sought to address. The medical literature of the 1920s and 1930s is full of case studies that begin with correction and end with complication. Some of those cases required surgical intervention to remove the migrated material. Some were never fully corrected. The lesson was written early. Some things injected into the face do not stay where they are put. That lesson was not forgotten exactly. It was incorporated into the long and complicated history of injectable fillers that followed, a history that is in some ways a series of attempts to find a substance that would stay where it was placed, that the body would accept without reaction, and that could be removed if necessary. Each iteration of the technology addressed the failures of the previous one, and introduced new complications of its own. The liquid silicone era of the 1960s and 1970s was the most consequential of these iterations, because silicone was used on a wide scale before its problems were well understood, and because those problems, when they appeared, were both serious and irreversible. Liquid silicone, injected directly into the tissue, not encapsulated in an implant, was used by thousands of practitioners in the United States and internationally, often in combination with other substances, often in quantities that far exceeded what responsible practice would later determine to be safe. The results range from satisfactory to catastrophic. The complications included migration, the silicone moving through the tissue over years, appearing in unexpected locations, sometimes decades after injection. Because silicone cannot be dissolved, these complications were permanent. The FDA ultimately prohibited the use of liquid silicone for cosmetic injection in the United States in the 1990s. But by then, many women were already living with the consequences of treatments they had received years earlier. Some of those women were still seeking surgical solutions to silicone-related complications well into the 21st century. The collagen era of the 1980s introduced what felt, at the time, like a genuine advance, a natural substance derived from bovine collagen that was biocompatible in most patients and that would, by its very nature, eventually be absorbed by the body. The concept of the temporary filler, the filler that doesn't last, that the body reclaims over time, was born here. It was a direct response to the permanence problem of silicone, and it represented a real improvement. The allergy test that collagen required, a small injection in the forearm, observed for several weeks before the facial treatment, also introduced for the first time a formal safety step into the cosmetic injection process. But the collagen results were relatively modest, and the allergy test was an inconvenience, and the duration of the effect was short. The market wanted something better, and in the late 1990s something better arrived. Hyaluronic acid is a molecule that exists naturally in the human body. It is found in the skin, in the joints, in the vitreous fluid of the eye. It has a remarkable property. It binds water molecules with extraordinary efficiency, holding many times its own weight in fluid. This makes it naturally volumizing, a substance that, when present in tissue, holds that tissue plump and supple. The loss of hyaluronic acid from the skin is one of the mechanisms by which aging produces the appearance of volume loss. The synthesis of hyaluronic acid for commercial use, and its stabilization into a gel form that could persist in tissue long enough to be clinically useful, was a genuine achievement of biotechnology. The first approved product, Restylane, was developed by a Swedish company and approved in Europe in 1996 and in the United States in 2003. The approval represented the culmination of years of research into not just the chemistry of the substance, but its behavior in tissue, how it degraded, how long it lasted, how the body responded to it. The response the body had to hyaluronic acid filler was, in the main, cooperative. The immune system recognized the substance as chemically similar to its own hyaluronic acid and did not mount the kind of inflammatory response that foreign materials typically provoke. The allergy test was not required. The substance was soft, mobile within the tissue, and produced results that looked, in most cases, more natural than the harder fillers that had preceded it. And it could be dissolved. This was the crucial claim. The enzyme hyaluronidase, injected into filler-treated tissue, could break down the hyaluronic acid chains that gave the filler its structure, causing the gel to lose its viscosity and be absorbed by the body. The process was rapid, typically visible within hours, complete within days. A treatment that had gone wrong could be corrected. A result that a patient didn't like could be undone. The product was, in the fullest sense, reversible. The market moved very quickly. By the mid-2000s, hyaluronic acid fillers had become the dominant product in the soft tissue filler category worldwide. By the late 2000s, dozens of brands and formulations were available, each with specific characteristics intended to suit different treatment areas and different desired outcomes. Restylane and Juvederm became household names, at least in the households that discussed these things. The treatment was no longer niche. It was in many circles routine. What the culture was offering in those years was a version of the promise that has always attended cosmetic alteration, but delivered with a lightness, a brevity, a casual accessibility that changed the emotional texture of the choice. This was not surgery. You did not need to take time off work. You did not need to tell anyone. You did not need to plan or save or prepare in the ways that surgery demanded. You sat in a chair. Someone with gloved hands pressed a needle into your skin. 20 minutes later, you got up, walked out, and went back to your life. The Botox market had already begun to normalize this kind of experience in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Botox parties had become a social phenomenon, gatherings at which women would have the injections together in someone's living room, with wine and conversation, as if the procedure were closer to a spa day than a medical intervention. The medicalization of cosmetic treatment was being deliberately, consciously softened. The needle was being reframed as a tool of maintenance rather than transformation. The clinic was being made to feel less clinical. By 2011, the year that peer-reviewed journals were quietly documenting something most patients had not been told, the filler industry had become, in the United States alone, a market worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually. The American Society of Plastic Surgeons reported that soft tissue filler procedures had increased by more than 300% in the decade since 2000. That number would continue to climb for another decade. The treatment had become, in those years, something that the women who had it described to each other with a casual familiarity that would have been impossible to imagine in the decade before. "You should try it," they said. "It's quick. It just makes you look more like yourself. I wish I'd done it years ago. I'd done it." The language of the recommendation was important. It was the language of restoration, not transformation, of recovery, not acquisition. The filler restored what had been lost, and the loss had been the problem, and the restoration was the solution, and the solution was temporary because everything that was good about it, the naturalness, the subtlety, the coherence with the face it was placed in, depended on its temporary quality. A temporary treatment that made you look more like yourself was not cosmetic surgery. It was barely even cosmetic, it was just maintenance. That framing was successful because it was, in the ways that mattered for the immediate experience, largely accurate. Most women who had well-administered hyaluronic acid filler, in conservative volumes, by experienced practitioners, had exactly the experience the framing promised. They looked rested. They looked like themselves. The result faded over months, and they came back, and the result was achieved again. The cycle was self-contained, self-reinforcing, and satisfied the condition it had been designed to satisfy. What the reversibility claim was not accounting for, what the clinical literature of 2009, 2010, and 2011 was beginning to document, was the long-term behavior of the product in the tissue, across multiple sessions, over years. The product that faded from the patient's perception, the product that had by all clinical signs been absorbed, was not always absent. It had simply changed form and location, and the clinical eye could no longer see it. But the imaging eye could. And what the imaging eye was seeing, in the faces of patients who had been receiving filler for years, was something that the brochure had not included in its description of what would happen over time. The culture had promised a temporary solution to a permanent condition. The science was beginning to suggest that the temporariness was not quite what anyone had said. The paper appeared in a Swedish journal in 2009. Its title was technical, its language precise, its audience primarily the community of plastic surgeons and dermatologists who read such things professionally. It was not a frightening paper. It did not use alarming language. It described, in careful, measured terms, what had been observed in a series of patients who had undergone ultrasound imaging of their faces some years after receiving hyaluronic acid filler injections. The purpose of the imaging was routine. The patients were being assessed before further treatment, and ultrasound had become a useful tool for practitioners wanting to understand what the tissue they were working with actually contained. What the ultrasound showed was that the filler was not where it had been put. In a significant number of cases the gel had moved, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but measurably. It had spread through the tissue layers. It had settled in places adjacent to the original injection site. In some patients, it had migrated centimeters from where the needle had placed it. The movements were not random. They followed the paths of least resistance in the tissue, the spaces between muscle layers, the anatomical planes along which the face moves with expression, the corridors that gravity and the body's own architecture create over time. The paper's authors were careful. They did not claim that migration was dangerous in and of itself. They did not claim that it produced visible adverse effects in all or most patients. They documented what they had seen, offered a considered interpretation of why it might be happening, and recommended that practitioners be aware of the phenomenon when planning subsequent treatments. The tone was measured. The conclusion was modest. The implication, for anyone reading carefully, was significant. The paper was published. It was read by the relevant professionals. It was cited over the following years by other researchers who were asking the same questions. By 2011, a body of evidence was accumulating. Small studies, case reports, imaging reviews that collectively documented what is now called filler migration as a real, measurable, more common than previously acknowledged phenomenon. The question of why this information did not travel quickly from the journals to the clinics to the patients is a complicated one, and it does not have a single answer. It is not in the main a story of deliberate concealment. It is more a story of the ordinary ways in which medical knowledge moves, slowly through professional channels, into guidelines that are updated infrequently, and then into clinical practice that tends to lag behind even those updated guidelines. Between the publication of a finding in a specialist journal and its arrival in the routine consent conversation in the average clinic, years typically pass, sometimes decades. This lag is not unique to aesthetic medicine. It is a feature of how medical knowledge works in general, how the distance between the laboratory and the consulting room is longer than most patients imagine, and how the information that reaches patients is always, to some degree, a simplified and delayed version of what the research community actually knows. The lag is not always harmful. Most findings require replication, context, and time to interpret before they should change practice. But when the lag involves information that patients would clearly want in order to make informed decisions about their own treatment, it represents a genuine failure of the system that connects knowledge to care. It is also, in part, a story about how the filler industry was structured at that time, and about the relationship between the practitioners who administered the treatments and the companies that made the products. The hyaluronic acid filler market, by the early 2000s, was dominated by a small number of large pharmaceutical companies. Allergan, the maker of Juvederm, was one of the largest cosmetic companies in the world, with a range of products that included both Botox and the Juvederm family of fillers. Galderma, the maker of Restylane, was another major player, a subsidiary of Nestlé with a global reach and a significant research and development budget. These companies invested heavily in training programs for practitioners, seminars, certifications, educational events that were often partially funded by the companies themselves. The training was technically competent. It covered injection technique, facial anatomy, the specific properties of each product in the manufacturer's portfolio, and the management of the most common immediate complications. Practitioners who attended these sessions came away better equipped for the immediate challenges of the treatment than those who did not. But the content of those training programs was, understandably, shaped by the priorities of the companies that funded them. Migration research was not a prominent feature. The long-term behavior of filler in tissue was not extensively discussed. The limitations of reversibility as a guarantee were not a central concern. This is not unusual in medicine, and it is not inherently corrupt. Pharmaceutical and medical device companies have always been involved in the education of the practitioners who use their products, and that involvement has always carried a potential for the shaping of emphasis, the focusing of attention on the benefits and the backgrounding of the complications. The regulatory frameworks in most countries try to manage this through disclosure requirements, through independent educational standards, through the expectation that practitioners will seek out the broader literature and not rely solely on company-funded training for their continuing education. But the aesthetic medicine market was growing so quickly, and the regulatory frameworks governing it were so thin, that these expectations were not uniformly met. A practitioner who had trained initially in a different area of medicine, a nurse, a general practitioner, a dentist, who was now offering filler as part of a broader cosmetic practice, might have their entire understanding of the product shaped by the training programs the manufacturers offered. If those programs did not emphasize migration, the practitioner did not know to emphasize it to their patients. Not through dishonesty, but through the ordinary limits of a training that had not covered the full picture. So the papers accumulated in the journals, and the journals sat on the shelves of medical libraries, and the women in the waiting rooms looked at before and after photographs, and the consultation conversations proceeded along familiar tracks. There is a specific gap in the knowledge that the migration research exposed, and it concerns a distinction that the filler market had never clearly drawn. The distinction between a product that has stopped working clinically and a product that has gone away. The duration figures printed on filler packaging, 6 to 12 months, 12 to 18 months, up to 2 years depending on the product and the treatment area, were measures of clinical effect. They were the time before which most patients would notice that the volume had decreased and the original appearance had returned, prompting them to return for a top-up. That measure was real. It was honest in what it described, but it was describing something different from what patients were commonly understanding it to describe. When a patient was told her filler would last 12 months, she typically understood this to mean that after 12 months the filler would no longer be present. It would have been absorbed. The body would have reclaimed the space. She would be, in effect, back where she started, with a tissue that was as unaffected by the treatment as it had been before. The distinction between clinical invisibility and absence was one that the research was beginning to make visible, literally visible on ultrasound, but that the consumer communication around the product had never addressed. The product might look like it was gone. It might behave as if it were gone, no longer producing the volume, no longer detectable by the practitioner's fingers pressing on the skin. But the imaging was showing that something was still there, changed in form, changed in location, but present. One of the more striking findings from the imaging studies that followed was the degree to which long-term filler patients, women who had been receiving treatments over periods of 3, 5, 8 or more years, had accumulated product that bore almost no relationship to the placement history that was documented in their records, because migration had distributed it through the tissue in ways that the treatment notes couldn't account for. A face that had been treated 20 times over 10 years might, on imaging, show filler distributed through the mid-face in a way that resembled the natural appearance of volume, diffuse, soft, settled into the tissue. But that was, structurally, a presence that would complicate any subsequent treatment or surgical procedure in ways that the treating practitioner had no way of anticipating without that imaging. The women who would eventually encounter this information, years after receiving their first treatment, often described the experience of learning it as a particular kind of disorientation. Not quite shock, because there was nothing dramatic in the moment of discovery, but a slow rearrangement of how they understood what they had done and what had been done to them, and what the word temporary had actually meant. The word temporary is still used in filler marketing. Its meaning, in light of the research, is more nuanced than it was when the word was coined for this purpose. That nuance is still not routinely communicated. The gap between what the science knows and what the patient is told is narrower now than it was in 2011, but it has not closed. The science was doing its patient work in those years. The slow, careful, undramatic work of imaging faces and interpreting what the images showed, and writing it down and publishing it, and waiting for it to matter. The market was moving at a different speed entirely, and in the space between those two speeds, in the pause between what was known and what was communicated, the needles kept moving through the rooms, and the filler kept accumulating in the tissue, and the word temporary kept being spoken in the consultation rooms of the world. The specific anatomical reason why filler migrates, and why this was not better anticipated from the beginning, deserves a more detailed explanation than is typically given in accessible accounts of the research. The face is not a uniform medium. It is a layered structure, skin on the outside, then subcutaneous fat, then a fibromuscular layer called the SMAS, then deeper fat compartments, then the periosteum that covers the facial skeleton, then bone. These layers are not sealed compartments. They communicate with each other through tissue planes, fascial connections, and the spaces that the facial musculature creates as it moves through its thousands of daily contractions. When filler is placed into a specific layer, the superficial dermis, or the deep subcutaneous fat, or just above the periosteum, it is placed into a tissue environment that is not static. The face moves constantly. Expressions, chewing, speaking, sleeping on one side, all of these produce forces that act on the tissue and on anything placed within it. The assumption that filler would stay where it was placed assumed a tissue environment that was more fixed than the actual tissue environment of the face. The 2009 Swedish study used high-frequency ultrasound to examine the tissue of patients who had previously received lip filler. Ultrasound is sensitive enough to distinguish between tissue types at the scale of millimeters, and it is particularly good at identifying hyaluronic acid filler, which appears as a distinct echogenic mass within the surrounding tissue. What the researchers found was that the filler was not only where it had been placed. In a significant proportion of cases, the product had moved into the perioral region, the tissue around and below the lips, that had not been treated. the distance of the migration varied. In some cases it was a matter of a few millimeters, significant enough to change the appearance of the treated area, but not dramatically different from where the product had been placed. In others, the product had travelled considerably further, into the tissue of the chin or into the philtrum, or into areas of the cheek that had not been injected. The distribution was consistent with the anatomy of the tissue planes through which the product would have had the easiest passage. Subsequent studies using MRI, which provides a different and in some ways more complete view of the tissue than ultrasound, at the cost of resolution at the millimetre scale, confirmed and extended these findings. They showed not only that migration occurred, but that it occurred over time, that the product that was where it had been placed immediately after injection was not necessarily where it remained after months and years of facial movement and tissue adaptation. This is the finding that the consent conversation of the 2000s boom should have included, not as an alarm, not as a reason to refuse the treatment, but as a piece of information about what the treatment does in the body over time. Information that a patient needs to make a genuinely informed decision about whether to begin it and how to continue it. Somewhere between 2015 and 2018, the conversation changed. It did not change because of the medical journals. It changed because of a phone screen, and a particular face, and a particular moment in which that face became something that millions of women studied and absorbed and in many cases began to compare themselves to. The face was Kylie Jenner's. She was 17 years old in 2015. She had, in the month since her 16th birthday, transformed the appearance of her lips, a transformation she initially attributed to lip liner and makeup technique, and that a generation of young women spent months attempting to replicate through tutorials before she admitted, under considerable public pressure, that the transformation had involved filler. The admission came in April 2015 in an episode of her family's television program, and it was received not as a cautionary disclosure but as a relief, an explanation, a permission, and in a very specific sense a tutorial. She was not the first celebrity to have filler, she was not even the first to admit it, but the timing of her admission, and its medium, and the particular cultural moment it landed in, made it something different from what had come before. She was young, and she was followed by a young audience, and the admission normalised the treatment for a generation that had not previously considered it as something they might do. The Kylie Jenner lip filler admission did something that no medical journal could have done. It made the treatment legible to a generation that had grown up online, accustomed to the idea that appearance was something you worked on, something you updated, something you shared. Within weeks of the admission, searches for lip fillers and related terms spiked dramatically across every search engine and social platform. Within months, clinics reported substantial increases in requests specifically for lip augmentation in patients under 30. A word was coined for the phenomenon, the Kylie effect. The Kylie effect was real and measurable, and it reflected something that was already underway in the culture before she named it. Social media had been reshaping beauty standards for several years by 2015, and the reshaping had a particular quality that was new in the history of beauty culture. Previous beauty ideals, the hourglass of the 1950s, the waif of the 1990s, the toned athletic ideal of the 2000s, had been distributed through mass media that were understood to be separate from the viewer. A magazine was not you. A television screen was not you. The celebrities and models in those media inhabited a world that was visibly, structurally distinct from the viewer's own. The gap was obvious, and while the gap was not harmless, the research on the effects of idealized media imagery on body image is extensive and unambiguous about the damage it causes. It was at least legible as a gap. Social media changed this. The images on a social media feed were not all celebrities, and not all models, and not all professionally lit and photographed. They were also neighbours and classmates, and people the viewer knew or half knew or followed because of a vague resemblance to someone they wanted to be. The ideals were distributed through the network of social connection, and that distribution made them feel proximate in a way that magazine ideals never had. And then the filters arrived. The facial filters that proliferated across Instagram, Snapchat and TikTok in the late 2000s were, from a beauty technology perspective, remarkable. They smoothed skin, they brightened eyes, they narrowed noses and lifted jawlines and enlarged lips and added volume to cheeks. They produced in real time and without any technical knowledge on the part of the user a version of the face that looked like the face after professional photography, lighting, and retouching. They were available to anyone, free, applied with a tap. What the filters did, in terms of beauty standards, was collapse the distance between the aspirational and the ordinary. You did not have to look at a magazine to see an idealized face. You looked at your own phone screen, and you saw your own face, filtered, and the filtered face was available for comparison with the unfiltered face at any moment. The gap between who you were and who you looked like under the filter was visible and immediate and personal, in a way that no magazine had ever been. Researchers who study the psychology of social media and body image documented this effect from the early years of filter availability. The term selfie-esteem, a pun on the word self-esteem, was coined to describe the fluctuating relationship between self-image and social media use, and the research behind the term was not encouraging. Users who spent more time on highly visual social media platforms showed higher rates of body dissatisfaction. Users who used filters showed the most pronounced effects, because the filter created a standard that was simultaneously extremely personal. It was literally your face, and completely artificial. Into this environment arrived the filler clinic. The logic was almost inevitable. The filter produced a face you could not have without intervention. The intervention that most closely approximated the filter's effects, plumped lips, lifted cheeks, smooth skin, was non-surgical, accessible, relatively affordable, and described as temporary. The practitioners' before and after photographs, posted to the same platforms that hosted the filters, showed the filter's effects achieved in real tissue. The filler boom of 2018 to 2022 was not simply a beauty trend. It was the market's response to a specific set of technological and cultural conditions that had created a new category of demand. Women were not seeking in the main to look like celebrities. They were seeking to look like their filtered selves, to close the gap between the face as the algorithm processed it and the face as the mirror showed it. The target was personal and specific, and in a particular way, intimate. The phenomenon acquired a clinical name in 2018 when Tejan Esho, a cosmetic doctor in London, coined the term Snapchat dysmorphia to describe patients presenting with filtered selfies as their reference image. Patients were arriving not with photographs of celebrities as they once had, but with photographs of themselves, filtered versions of their own faces, and asking to have their real faces made to match. The request was qualitatively different from anything that had come before. It was not aspiration toward an external ideal. It was aspiration toward a digitally altered version of the self, and the request was to make the digital alteration real. The term Snapchat dysmorphia entered the medical literature formally in 2018, in a letter to the editor published in the journal JAMA Facial Plastic Surgery. The letter was widely reported in the general media, and it sparked a conversation that has continued since about the relationship between digital image culture and cosmetic procedure. The conversation was valuable, and the concept it named was real. But it tended in public discourse to focus on the most extreme presentations, the patients who were clearly distressed, who had unrealistic expectations, who were seeking procedures that no responsible practitioner would provide. The more common situation, the patient who was not distressed, who had reasonable expectations, who wanted a modest improvement that the filtered selfie had given her a template for, did not make for headlines, but it made for an enormous percentage of the consultations happening in clinics around the world in those years. These were women whose experience of filler was genuinely positive, at least in the short term, and who had no particular reason to investigate the clinical literature on migration. The patients were getting younger. This was noted in the clinical literature from about 2017 onward. The median age of filler patients had been, in the early 2010s, broadly in line with what clinicians expected. Women in their late 30s and 40s seeking to address the volume loss that comes with aging. By the late 2000s, the patient profile had shifted significantly. Women in their 20s were now a major part of the market. The average age at first injection was falling. The younger patients were, in the main, seeking something different from what the older patients were seeking. The older patients were replacing what they had lost. The younger patients were adding what they had never had, approaching, incrementally, the template that social media had provided. The cumulative filler risk, the slow accumulation of product in tissue over multiple sessions year after year, was highest in this population, because they had started early and because the treatment, by design, required repetition. There is a detail from the economics of that period that is worth noting, because it shaped the market in ways that the clinical conversation did not always account for. By the late 2000s, the cost of filler treatments had declined significantly from where it had been in the early 2000s. The market had expanded, the number of practitioners had increased, and competition had driven prices down. In major cities in the United Kingdom and Australia, where the regulatory environment had allowed the widest participation in the market, lip filler treatments were available for prices equivalent to a modest restaurant dinner. The accessibility was genuine. It was also, in retrospect, a part of the story. When a medical treatment is priced at a level that suggests it is not quite medicine, not the serious, considered, relationship-based medicine of the GP or the specialist, but the casual, drop-in, affordable medicine of the beauty treatment, the psychological framing of the decision changes. You do more due diligence before having a filling at the dentist than before having filler in your lips, because the dentist is clearly a medical person in a clearly medical setting, making a clearly medical intervention. The filler clinic by the late 2000s and 10s occupied a different category, one that the marketing had carefully constructed and that the price point confirmed. The culture had promised something quick, easy, affordable, and reversible. The culture had delivered, in most cases, exactly that. The part it had not mentioned was still waiting patiently in the tissue, visible on ultrasound, documented in the literature, and moving slowly and imperceptibly through the planes of the face. There is a quality to the way filter culture operated on female self-perception that the research on social comparison only partially captures, because it was not only about comparison between one face and another, it was about comparison between a face and itself. The self-comparison produced by filters is distinct from the social comparison produced by exposure to images of other women. When a woman uses a smoothing filter, a slimming filter, a jawline sharpening filter on her own photograph, she's not comparing herself to a model or an influencer or an abstract beauty standard. She's comparing herself to a modified version of herself, a version that looks like her, has her features, carries her identity markers, but looks as she would look if her face met the standard the filter encodes. This self-comparison with an altered self-image is, in the research literature on body image, one of the most potent generators of appearance dissatisfaction. It is not abstract. It is personal. It shows not just that the standard exists, but that the standard is achievable for this specific face. It would look like this. It would feel like you, if only the actual face could be made to match the filtered one. The gap between the filtered face and the unfiltered face becomes a lived experience of deficit rather than an abstract aspiration. The filler consultation, for women who had been spending significant time with filtered versions of their own faces, was sometimes a step toward closing that gap. The practitioner was offering to make the unfiltered face closer to what the filtered one looked like. In that context, the decision to proceed was not a luxury or a vanity. It was, for some women, a practical response to a concrete and daily experienced discrepancy. The word migration is clinical. It does not quite capture what it feels like to understand it. To migrate means to move from one place to another over time. In the context of dermal filler, it means that the gel placed precisely in the lip border, in the tear trough, in the hollow beneath the cheekbone, does not stay where it was placed. It shifts. It spreads. It follows the paths that the body's own movement, gravity, and tissue architecture have laid down over years of living in that particular face. The face is not a static structure. It moves hundreds of times a day, in conversation, in sleep, in the small unconscious expressions that accompany thought and feeling. Every time the muscles of the face contract, they exert pressure on the tissue that surrounds them. That pressure, repeated over months and years, has consequences for a substance placed in that tissue. The pressure is not dramatic. It is the gentle, persistent pressure of living, of speaking and eating and laughing and squinting in sunlight and pressing a face into a pillow at night. It is ordinary and it is constant, and over time it moves things. The imaging studies that began to accumulate after 2009 used ultrasound, and in some cases MRI, to look at faces that had received filler some years prior. What they found was consistent, and it was more widespread than most practitioners had anticipated. Ultrasound imaging reveals hyaluronic acid filler as a white hyperechoic mass. Bright, reflective, distinct from the surrounding tissue in a way that makes it identifiable to an experienced sonographer. The brightness of the image depends partly on how the filler has changed over time. Fresh, intact gel appears uniformly bright, while older product that has degraded or migrated may appear differently distributed, sometimes in smaller discrete collections, sometimes in diffuse patterns that spread across a larger area of the image. What the imaging was showing, in patient after patient, was that the filler that had been placed precisely in one location had not remained in that location. It was somewhere else, or several somewhere else's, distributed through the tissue in ways that the original injection notes did not describe and that the patient herself had not been aware of. In one frequently cited study of lip filler patients, researchers found product not just in the lips but in the tissue around the mouth, in the nasolabial folds, and in some cases in the chin and lower face, areas that had not been injected. The patients in this study had received lip filler treatments over a period of years, returning for top-ups as the clinical effect faded. None of them had been told that the product from previous sessions might still be present in their tissue, distributed through areas they had not intended to treat. In studies of tear trough filler, a treatment for the hollow beneath the eye, one of the more anatomically delicate applications in the filler practitioner's repertoire, patients were found, on imaging, to have product that had drifted into the cheek, the lower eyelid, and in a small number of cases into the periorbital fat, the fatty tissue immediately surrounding the eye socket. The periorbital location is significant because of the proximity to the structures of the eye and the relative difficulty of accessing it for dissolution. The distances involved were not always dramatic. 1 centimetre, 2 centimetres, the width of a finger. But in the architecture of a face, 1 centimetre is significant. The lip border is only a few millimetres wide. The distance between the tear trough and the eye socket is measured in fractions of a centimetre. The cheek and the nasolabial fold are adjacent structures, but they have different anatomical properties, different depths, different relationships to the muscles of expression. When filler drifts from one to the other, it is in different tissue than it was designed for, and it behaves differently, sometimes producing a fullness that the patient didn't intend, sometimes contributing to the gradual thickening of the mid-face that became visually identifiable as the accumulated filler look of the late 2000s and 10s. The most common visible consequence is what clinicians call the pillow face, or the filler face, a specific recognizable appearance that results from years of accumulated product in the mid-face. The tissue looks heavy, the movement of the face is subtly reduced, the natural contours are softened into something that is not quite the face as it was, and not quite the result that was sought, but something in between. A face that carries its history in its tissue, legible if you know what to look for, invisible if you don't. Not all migration is visible, that is perhaps the more important point. Much of what the imaging studies found was invisible to the naked eye, detectable only by ultrasound, only by the trained reading of what appears on the screen. A woman who had received filler 5 years prior, who looked entirely natural, whose appearance pleased her, might have, on ultrasound, a distribution of product that was substantially different from what had been placed at the time of the injection. She would have no way of knowing this without the imaging. She would have no reason to seek the imaging because nothing in her appearance suggested anything was wrong. This is one of the most significant aspects of the migration story, and it is the one that generates the most complicated feelings when women who have received filler first hear it. The product has moved in ways that are invisible, but that are nonetheless real, affecting the tissue, affecting the anatomy, existing in a location that was never the plan, the face that looks fine, the face that the patient is happy with, the face that the practitioner is pleased to have produced, may be carrying a distribution of product that will complicate future treatments in ways nobody has accounted for. The implications for subsequent treatment are significant. A woman who presents to a clinic for additional filler and who does not disclose previous injections, or who does disclose them, but whose records are not available, or whose previous practitioners are unknown, may be injected into tissue that already contains product from previous sessions, possibly in a location neither she nor her practitioner would expect. The total volume of filler in the tissue may be much higher than the visible or reported history suggests. This accumulation risk was recognized by experienced practitioners before the formal imaging research made it widely visible. The practitioners who had been working in aesthetic medicine for the longest time, who had treated the same patients over many years and who had observed in those patients the gradual changes that came with repeated treatment, had developed an intuitive sense of the cumulative picture that the imaging research would later document quantitatively. Some of them had already adjusted their practice accordingly, becoming more conservative about volume, more likely to assess the tissue for existing product before adding more willing to recommend intervals between treatments. But this intuitive knowledge was not systematically transmitted. It was not in the training materials, it was not in the consent forms, it was held by individual practitioners, developed through experience, and shared in the informal conversations at the conferences and seminars where the more experienced members of the profession talked to each other. The patient who happened to find one of those experienced conservative practitioners benefited from that knowledge without necessarily knowing it was being applied. The patient who found a practitioner who had not yet developed that experience, who was newer to the field, who had learned from training materials that emphasized technique over long-term management, was in a different situation. The surgical literature began to formalize the clinical picture in the late 2000s when a particular category of case report emerged: the surgical patient who presented for a facelift or other facial procedure and whose intraoperative findings surprised the operating surgeon. A surgeon making an incision in the face expects to encounter certain structures in certain locations: the skin, the subcutaneous fat, the facial fascia, the muscle, the deeper fat compartments. These are the layers of the face as anatomy describes them, and the experienced surgeon navigates them with a spatial understanding developed over years of training and practice. When the surgeon encounters something unexpected in one of those layers, a mass, a substance, a resistance that shouldn't be there, it requires attention and usually some form of intervention before the planned procedure can continue. The unexpected substance that surgeons began reporting in case studies from the late 2010s onward was filler, product placed in the tissue over years of repeated injections, that had migrated from its original location, that had integrated into the tissue in ways that made it difficult to remove, that the patient herself had not known was there because nobody had told her to expect it. One plastic surgeon, writing in a professional journal in 2019, described operating on a patient who presented for a facelift and discovering what she described as a continuous shelf of filler material in the mid-face, product that extended across the cheek from one side of the face to the other, incorporated into the tissue in a way that required meticulous dissection to remove. The patient had not been aware that this was the state of her tissue. She had been having filler treatments for approximately 8 years, returning every 6 to 12 months for top-ups, and in all that time nobody had imaged the tissue or suggested that the cumulative picture might look like this. That case was not isolated. Similar reports appeared in the surgical literature from practitioners in the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia and South Korea, with sufficient consistency that, by the early 2020s, the cumulative filler problem had become a recognized consideration in pre-surgical planning for facial procedures. Practitioners performing such procedures were advised to routinely ask patients about their filler history, and, in cases where significant product use was disclosed or suspected, to consider imaging before proceeding. This advice was appropriate and important. It was also advice that the patient could not have given herself 10 years earlier, when the first treatment was offered to her, because the advice had not yet been formulated in response to evidence that had not yet accumulated. The migration story is, at its most fundamental level, a story about time. The evidence is what time produces, what the tissue looks like when years of treatment are examined rather than individual sessions. The patient who knew the most about her own tissue was always the one who had been treated for the longest, but the information that her tissue contained was, for most of that time, not available to her in any form she could access or interpret. It was in the tissue, and the tissue, for most of that time, was not being looked at. The imaging studies that documented migration also revealed something about the anatomy that had not been previously well understood in the context of filler placement. The facial fat compartments are more connected than early injection training assumed. The face was long conceptualized in filler training as a collection of discrete zones: the lips, the nasolabial folds, the cheeks, the tear troughs, the temples, each of which could be treated more or less independently. This zone-based thinking was clinically useful. It gave practitioners a framework for planning treatment, for discussing results with patients, and for assessing the outcome of a session. But it was a simplification of anatomy that the tissue itself does not fully observe. The fat compartments of the face are separated by retaining ligaments, fibrous structures that anchor the skin to the deeper tissues and that create the structural boundaries between adjacent facial regions. These ligaments are real and functionally significant, but they are not impermeable walls. Product placed on one side of a retaining ligament can, over time, work its way to the other side, not dramatically, not immediately, but through the slow action of the tissue forces that the face generates in its daily movement. The nasolabial fold is particularly instructive in this regard. It is one of the most commonly treated areas in filler medicine, the fold that runs from the side of the nose to the corner of the mouth, which becomes more prominent with age as the cheek fat descends and the tissue loses its support. Filler placed in the nasolabial fold can provide a visible improvement by filling the depression, but it can also, over time and with repeated treatment, migrate inferiorly, downward toward the chin and the jawline, contributing to what experienced practitioners describe as the heavy lower face, a redistribution of volume that changes the overall structure of the face in ways that were not the intended result. Understanding the nasolabial fold migration pattern changed the approach of practitioners who were paying attention to it. Rather than treating the fold directly with high volumes of product, the more anatomically informed approach is to treat the structural deficit that causes the fold, to restore support higher in the cheek, allowing the fold to improve as a secondary consequence of addressing its cause, rather than as a primary target of injection. This is subtler, requires more anatomical knowledge, and produces less immediately dramatic results, but it avoids the cumulative lower face heaviness that direct repeated nasolabial filling tends to produce. This is one of the ways that the migration research changed clinical practice in real and specific terms, not just as a consent disclosure item, but as an understanding of the anatomy that informed how the treatments were designed. There is a particular quality to the consultation room. It is clean. It is well lit, but not harshly so. The light is the kind that flatters, which in a cosmetic clinic is partly a practical consideration and partly a reassurance. There are diplomas on the wall, and before and after photographs arranged in pairs, and a mirror with good light, and a chair that is comfortable in the way that chairs in professional settings are made to be comfortable. Enough ease to relax, not enough to make you forget you are somewhere that is making an assessment. The person across from you is knowledgeable. They speak in a register that is both medical and accessible, using terms you have heard before without always knowing their precise meaning. They ask what brings you in today, and you tell them, and they look at your face with a clinical attention that somehow also manages to feel kind. They may use the mirror, hold it at an angle, point to the places you've mentioned, explain what they can address and how. The conversation has a structure that feels logical, unhurried, professional. This is the consultation, and the consultation, in the years we're talking about, was often the only occasion on which certain information might have been given, and was often the occasion on which it was not. To understand how this happened requires understanding something about the structure of consent in cosmetic medicine, and about how that structure differs from what most people assume it to be. In clinical medicine, in the treatment of disease, in surgery performed for health reasons, informed consent is a formal, documented process. The patient must be told, in terms they can understand, the nature of the treatment, its risks, its alternatives, and the likely consequences of declining it. The documentation of this process is required by law in most jurisdictions and by the ethical codes of the professional bodies that govern clinical practice. The patient's right to ask questions, to take time, to consult other practitioners before deciding is protected. The practitioner's obligation to provide accurate and complete information is enforceable. In cosmetic medicine, the consent process varies enormously. In the most reputable clinics, with the most rigorous practitioners, it closely resembles the clinical standard. Written materials provided in advance, a consultation period that is not rushed, time allowed between the consultation and the treatment so that the patient can consider the information without the pressure of an immediate decision. In the broader market, in the beauty salon with the Friday afternoon appointment, in the pop-up clinic at the hotel conference room, in the online booking that arrives in the patient's chair without a prior conversation, The consent process might be a verbal summary of the most likely outcomes, a signature on a form that the patient has had 30 seconds to read, and a pair of gloves already being snapped into place. The information about migration, about the fact that hyaluronic acid filler does not stay reliably in the location where it is placed, about the implications of cumulative use over years, about the limitations of hyaluronidase dissolution for long-term or deeply placed filler, was not, in the early 2000s, part of any standard consent disclosure. It was not part of the guidelines of the major professional bodies. It was not on the packaging of the products. It was in the journals, and the journals were not the room where the consent happened. The information that was disclosed in those years was the information that had been formalized, the immediate risks, the common side effects, the rare but serious possibilities, bruising, swelling, the possibility of nodules, the small risk of infection, the rare but serious risk of vascular occlusion, the injection of filler into a blood vessel, which could, in the most serious cases, cause tissue death or vision loss if not managed immediately. These were real risks, and the disclosure of them was appropriate and necessary. They were also acute risks, things that would happen, if they happened, in the days immediately following treatment, where they could be observed and addressed. The slow, cumulative, years-long risks that the migration research was documenting were not acute risks. They were the risks of repetition, of accumulation, of time. They were not the things that a single treatment consultation needed to address, if the consultation was only thinking about the single treatment in front of it. And in a market where most patients were booking appointment by appointment, session by session, with sometimes different practitioners at different clinics, there was no single consultation that had the view of the whole picture. There was only the view of the current session. The woman in the consultation chair said yes to something she understood to be temporary, reversible and well-defined in its risks. She was right about some of that. She was not given the full picture of the rest. This is not a judgment of the women who made those decisions. It is an observation about the information environment in which the decisions were made. People make reasonable decisions based on the information they are given. When the information is incomplete, the decision is made in good faith under conditions that do not fully represent reality. That is not the patient's failure. It is the failure of the system that was responsible for giving her what she needed. The system in question is not a single entity. It is the practitioner, and the professional body that governs the practitioner, and the training program that educated the practitioner, and the company that made the product and funded the training, and the regulator that classified the product and set the standards for its use, and the cultural conversation that framed the treatment as a beauty product rather than a medical procedure. All of these parts of the system had a role in the information that reached the patient and in the information that didn't. There is a quality to the memory of the consultation room that many of the women who later received fuller information describe in similar terms. Not anger, though anger is there too in some of them. More like a specific kind of disorientation, the feeling of looking at a memory and noticing now something in it that you couldn't have seen at the time. The practitioner was probably telling the truth. The form probably listed the relevant disclosures. The room probably looked exactly like what it was, a legitimate professional medical environment in which a trained person was offering a treatment that had been approved by regulatory authorities and used successfully by millions of women. All of that was real, and the wall behind the wall was also real. The information that wasn't in the room was not in the room, because the information wasn't required to be there, not because anyone had decided to hide it. Understanding that distinction matters, because the anger that is available in this story, and it is available, there are things here worth being angry about, is most usefully directed not at the individual practitioners, but at the structures that permitted the incomplete information to be the standard. The structures are the appropriate target, and they are also the things that are, slowly and imperfectly, changing. The British Association of Aesthetic Plastic Surgeons, the American Society of Plastic Surgeons, the Australasian College of Cosmetic Surgery, and the equivalent bodies in dozens of countries have all, in the years since the migration research became more prominent, updated their patient information guidelines and their consent recommendations. The updates are not revolutionary. They do not represent a wholesale reckoning, but they move the standard of disclosure in a direction that patients benefit from. A patient walking into a consultation in 2024 or 2025 at a clinic that is following current best practice should hear more about the long-term behavior of filler than the patient who walked into the same consultation a decade earlier. Should, the operative word. Not all clinics follow current best practice. Not all practitioners have engaged with the research that has emerged since the standards they trained under were set. The variation is still significant. The gap between the best practice and the average practice is still wider than it should be. But the movement is in the right direction, and the women who know to ask the questions, who walk into the consultation room informed enough to know what the room might not tell them unprompted, are better positioned than they were. The phrase that matters in that room, and that has mattered all along, is the one that the best practitioners have always offered before any patient has had to ask for it. Less is more. Not as a slogan, not as a marketing phrase, as a clinical philosophy, the genuine conviction held by the practitioners who have seen the most of what cumulative filler produces over time, that the treatment serves the patient best when it is conservative, when it respects the tissue, when it starts from less and evaluates before adding more, when it is honest about what the research shows and what it doesn't, and about what temporary means and what it doesn't. That practitioner is the one who earns the chair. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The bruising, if there was bruising, was usually gone within a week. The swelling took a little longer, a specific kind of swelling that experienced practitioners called filler swelling, distinct from the bruise swelling, a fullness in the tissue that needed to settle before the result could be seen clearly. It was not alarming in most cases. It was the body adjusting to what had been placed in it, organising itself around the new substance, finding the arrangement that the tissue could sustain. Most clinics told patients not to judge the result for 2 weeks. 2 weeks was the time the tissue needed to accommodate what had been placed in it, to arrange itself around the new substance, to find its equilibrium. For most women, the 2-week result was the desired one. The lips were fuller, or the hollows were softened, or the cheekbones were more present in the face, more like the face they had imagined. The face looked like itself, but, and this was the quality that made the experience so satisfying to most who had it, more so, more awake, more structured, more the face you had carried in your imagination than the face you had been carrying in the world. That quality, the feeling of the face having caught up with some internal image of itself, is one that researchers in aesthetic medicine have tried to characterize, and that is, in practice, genuinely difficult to describe. It is not quite confidence, though many women report feeling more confident. It is not quite comfort, though there is something in it that resembles ease. It is something closer to coherence, the sense that what others see when they look at you is closer to what you intended them to see, that the face and the person behind it are more aligned. For many women, that experience was straightforwardly positive and remained so. They had filler, they liked it, they continued to have it, and the treatment served them well for years. This story is not about those women being wrong or about their experience being invalid. It is about the information they were not given alongside the experience they had, and about what that information would have meant for the decisions they made. For others, the relationship with the change face was more complicated, and the complication began earlier than most of them had expected. Some women describe a period of adjustment that was longer and stranger than they had anticipated. The face in the mirror was theirs, and was improved in the ways they had wanted, and was also somehow slightly unfamiliar, a version of themselves that required a small act of recognition each time they encountered it. They would catch a reflection unexpectedly, in a shop window or a colleague's darkened phone screen, and feel for a moment that they were looking at someone they almost knew. The feeling was not distressing, it was disorienting, and it usually passed. For some, it didn't entirely. Body image researchers have a term for this: appearance schema adjustment. The internal model we carry of our own appearance is deep, persistent, and not easily updated. A change to the face, even a change that is objectively positive by the measures the patient herself would apply, requires the internal model to revise itself, and that revision takes time. For most people, it is seamless. The new face becomes the familiar face within weeks, and the before face begins to feel like the version from an old photograph rather than the version in the mirror. For others, particularly those whose relationship with their own appearance has been complicated by longer histories of dissatisfaction or criticism, the revision can take longer and feel less complete. There is a version of the adjustment experience that is particular to filler, and it was documented in clinical settings from the mid-2000s onward. The experience of not quite knowing when the original satisfaction became a new dissatisfaction, because the transition happened too gradually to identify. A patient would have a treatment and be satisfied with the result. She would return for a top-up because the effect had faded, or appeared to have faded, which, given the migration research, is a distinction that carries significance. She would be satisfied with that result too. She would return again. And at some point, often without a clear before and after to compare, she would notice that the face in the mirror looked different in a way she couldn't quite account for. Heavier in the mid-face, less mobile in expression, less like herself in some quality that wasn't the features she had originally wanted changed, but something more diffuse, something in the way the face sat. This is the experience that practitioners who work with cumulative filler patients describe most frequently when asked what they see clinically. Not the dramatic, overcorrected result that appears in cautionary photographs. Something subtler and in some ways more difficult to address. A face that has changed gradually, incrementally, in ways that added up to something nobody planned for, and that cannot easily be traced back to any specific decision. The change is in the tissue, and the tissue is not simply a passive container for what has been placed in it. Tissue is alive, it responds to what is placed in it. The cells of the tissue adapt to the presence of the filler, organizing themselves around it, in some cases forming the fibrous capsule that is the body's standard response to foreign material. The collagen in the tissue changes over years of repeated product placement. The mechanical properties of the tissue, its elasticity, its mobility, its capacity to move freely with expression, are affected by the cumulative presence of filler within it. The face that has received substantial filler over many years is not simply a face with filler in it. It is a face whose tissue has been changed by the filler, whose structure is different from what it would have been without the treatment, and that structural difference does not always dissolve when the product dissolves. This is the part of the story that the dissolution movement of the early 2020s made visible, because it was the part that became apparent when women who had expected dissolution to restore their original face discovered that the restoration was incomplete. The hyaluronidase injections that dissolve filler are effective, but they are not a reset button. They dissolve what they reach, at the depths they can reach, at the concentrations that can be safely administered. They do not dissolve product that has integrated deeply into the tissue, that has migrated to locations where the enzyme cannot easily be placed, or that has been in the tissue for so long that it has changed in ways that make it less responsive to enzymatic breakdown. And they cannot restore the tissue to what it was before it ever received filler. The tissue has adapted. It has changed. Some of those changes are reversible. The tissue will continue to adapt after the product is removed, and over months it will find a new equilibrium. Some of those changes are not reversible in the ways the patient might have hoped. Women who dissolved years of accumulated filler often describe a face after dissolution that is different from either the face before they started or the face at the height of their filler use. The skin may sit differently without the volume it had been supported by. In some cases, particularly where large volumes had been used over many years, the skin stretched by the filler may appear looser after dissolution than it would have been without any treatment at all. The tissue adapted upward, and now must adapt downward, and the downward adaptation is slower and less complete. This is not a universal experience. The experience depends on how much filler was used, how long the treatment continued, how deeply the product was placed, how the individual's tissue responded. Many women who dissolve filler are satisfied with the result. Some are delighted. The tissue without the product recovers its natural movement, its expressiveness, its relationship to the face's underlying architecture. The face looks more like itself. But the expectation that dissolution produces a return to before, to the face as it was before any treatment, is an expectation that the clinical evidence does not support for everyone, and that expectation was being formed in many women from the same incomplete information that had shaped all the decisions that preceded it. The body after is always the body after. It carries what it has been through. The filler, and the years, and the dissolution if there was dissolution, and the adaptations and readaptations and the gradual settlement toward whatever equilibrium the tissue can reach. This is not a condemnation of the treatment. It is a description of what a body is. a living thing that changes in response to what happens to it, that accumulates its history and its structure, that cannot be returned to any previous state by any intervention, however skilled. That is simply what bodies do, is what all of our bodies are doing all the time, regardless of what we put in them or take from them. The woman who understands this about her own body, who holds it with knowledge rather than with hope for a different kind of truth, is in a different relationship with the choices available to her. She is not in a worse relationship or a better one. She is in an honest one. And the honest relationship with the body is in the end the only sustainable one, the only one that doesn't require her to be somewhere other than where she actually is. The physical experience of a face that has accumulated filler over years is not something that is often described in patient-facing materials, because the patient-facing materials are produced before the accumulation has happened. Women who have been through years of treatment describe it in different ways. Some describe a sensation of heaviness, a weight in the tissue that is not painful but that is perceptible, particularly in the lower face where product tends to accumulate most significantly. Some describe a change in how the face moves, a sense that certain expressions are slightly more constrained than they used to be, that the tissue doesn't move as freely as it once did. Some describe a visual change that they notice gradually, a thickening or a shift in the facial landscape that crept in over months and years without a single dramatic change that would have prompted them to address it. Some describe none of these things. Some have accumulated significant volumes of product as documented by imaging and have felt and seen nothing that prompted concern. The experience of accumulated filler is individual, varying with the volume, the location, the tissue type, and the perceptual sensitivity of the person in whose face it is located. It does not announce itself reliably. It does not present in a way that the woman can clearly distinguish from the ordinary changes of a face living through time. This invisibility, the fact that accumulated filler often does not present as a clear problem until it becomes significant enough to be visually obvious, is one of the reasons the issue is difficult to manage proactively. A patient who feels fine and whose face looks fine to her own eye has no obvious clinical signal to respond to. The research finding that filler may have migrated to locations she was not treated in is an abstract piece of information, not a concrete experience. Making that abstract information concrete, translating the research finding into the specific individual experience of the patient in front of the practitioner, is one of the skills that the best practitioners in this space have developed. They describe the finding not in the language of the research paper, but in the language of what the patient would see and feel and eventually notice. They give the timeline not as a statistical distribution, but as a realistic account of what the years of treatment are likely to produce in this specific face, given its anatomy and its treatment history. That personalization is the difference between an informed consent process that genuinely informs and one that technically discloses. The technically disclosing process lists the risks. The genuinely informing process explains what those risks mean for this patient, in this face, over this probable treatment trajectory. It requires time and knowledge and the willingness to have a conversation rather than complete a form. The most consistent finding in the psychological research on cosmetic procedures is also, in some ways, the most quietly devastating. The research shows, repeatedly and across cultures, that cosmetic procedures produce improvements in body image satisfaction and self-esteem that are real, measurable, and significant for a period of time. Studies conducted in the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Brazil, South Korea, and multiple other countries have found this pattern with impressive consistency. The improvement is not illusory. It is not merely the placebo effect of feeling like one has done something. It is a genuine, statistically significant change in how patients rate their own appearance and their satisfaction with specific features that were treated. In most studies, that period of improvement lasts between 6 and 12 months. After that period, the improvements begin to erode, not completely, and not for everyone. Some patients maintain their satisfaction for much longer, particularly when the treatment addressed a specific, well-defined feature and the expectation was specific and well-defined to match. But in aggregate, across the studies, the satisfaction fades. The body image ratings return toward their pre-treatment levels, the self-esteem improvements attenuate. The face has changed. The thing that the face was supposed to address has not. This is not a revelation exactly in the sense that it has been known in the clinical and academic literature for decades. It is something that practitioners in aesthetic medicine discuss in continuing education contexts, that psychologists who study body image have been documenting since the emergence of cosmetic surgery as a mainstream practice, and that women who have been through multiple procedures often know in their own experience without having read the literature. The external change doesn't permanently fix the internal thing. The mirror still holds something after the procedure that it held before, a different something, but something. The thought is quieter for a while, then it returns. What is the internal thing? It varies, and it is always specific to the individual, but the research suggests some broad categories that appear across the studies with enough consistency to name. For some women, the internal thing is the discrepancy between how they perceive themselves and how they believe others perceive them, a gap that the cosmetic change narrows temporarily but does not close. This gap is not always based on accurate information. Research on how people assess their own attractiveness consistently shows that most people evaluate themselves less favourably than others evaluate them. A woman who believes her face is significantly less attractive than average is statistically more likely to be wrong about this than right. But the belief is real, and its effects are real, and the cosmetic treatment that addresses the appearance without addressing the belief produces relief that is proportional to the difference between the belief and the reality. For others, the internal thing is a deeper, more long-standing relationship with their own appearance that has been marked by experiences of criticism, comparison, or feeling unseen, experiences that accumulate over a lifetime and that a changed face cannot reach. The woman who was told repeatedly as a child that her nose was too big, or her lips were too thin, or her skin was the wrong colour or texture or tone, carries those messages in a place that the needle does not access. The product changes the tissue, the messages are elsewhere. For others still, the internal thing has nothing to do with appearance at all, a state of anxiety or unhappiness, or dissatisfaction with some aspect of life that the focus on the face provides a temporary displacement for. When the face is changed, and the anxiety or unhappiness remains, the displacement dissolves and the original thing resurfaces. The face was never the problem. It was the place the attention went when the attention needed somewhere to go. The psychologist Leslie Swartz, who has written extensively on body image and cosmetic surgery, describes this phenomenon with a formulation that stays. Appearance change, she argues, is always partly an attempt to manage an emotional experience through a physical solution that is not inherently problematic. There are real and meaningful connections between how we look and how we feel, and changing the appearance can genuinely change the experience of being in one's own body. But when the emotional experience is primarily internal, when it lives in the belief system, or the history or the relationship between the self and the world, rather than in the specific feature that the treatment addresses, the physical solution has limits that the consultation room does not always address. This is not an argument against cosmetic procedures. It is an argument for a different kind of conversation in the room where they are proposed, a conversation that the most thoughtful practitioners have been trying to have for years, often against the grain of a market that rewards speed and volume over reflection. The distinction between the filler consultation that serves the patient and the one that serves the appointment schedule is often visible in a single question, or its absence. The question is some version of, what specifically do you hope this will change about how you feel? Not how you look, how you feel. And is that something that this treatment, in this location, at this volume, is likely to address? The practitioner who asks this question, who does not rush past it, who listens to the answer and engages with it, who is willing to spend some part of the consultation on something that is not about technique or product or result, is operating at a level of care that the treatment actually requires. The practitioner who moves directly to the assessment of the face, the discussion of what can be done, the proposal of the treatment plan, is operating efficiently and professionally, and may produce a perfectly satisfactory outcome. But they have skipped the question that most determines whether that outcome will still be satisfactory in 12 months. There is a version of this that is specific to the filler consultation, and it is relevant to the migration story in a particular way. One of the things that filler addresses most effectively is volume loss, the thinning of the tissue that comes with aging, the hollowing of the temples and the under eyes and the mid-face that is among the most visible markers of aging in women over 40. When a practitioner replaces that volume with a well-placed, appropriately sized treatment, the result restores the face to a state it was actually in, removes the shadow under the eye that was not there 10 years ago, fills the hollow in the cheek that has appeared as the tissue has thinned. This is restoration in the most literal sense, and the satisfaction of women who have it done with this purpose tends to be high and sustained, because the treatment has done what it was asked to do. One of the things that filler addresses least effectively, though it is frequently used for this purpose, is the overall sense of not looking like yourself, or looking tired when you're not tired, or feeling that your face no longer matches the way you feel inside. These are real experiences, and they deserve real attention, and filler is sometimes part of the answer to them. But when the experience is primarily about identity or self-perception, rather than about a specific anatomical feature, the filler tends to produce a result that satisfies briefly and then requires something more, another session, a different treatment area, a new target, as the original experience of not quite becomes the new baseline. The women who were most vulnerable to cumulative filler use were not, in the main, the women who came in with a specific, well-defined request. They were the women who came in with a feeling, a general, difficult to specify feeling that something about the face was off, that they didn't quite look how they felt, that some quality they couldn't name had been lost. Each session produced a temporary relief from that feeling. The relief was real, and then it faded, and the feeling returned, and the next session was required. And the sessions accumulated, and the product accumulated, and at some point the face that looked back from the mirror was one that the woman recognized, but that also contained years of accumulated product in places it had not been placed, and in quantities that nobody had disclosed to her as a picture that would be true. The most important thing this cycle reveals is not about the product. It is about the question that was not asked before the product was placed. If the feeling driving the treatment is one that the treatment cannot address at its source, then the treatment will be required again and again, in a loop that serves the clinic's appointment schedule without serving the patient's actual need. And none of this is the patient's failure. A patient who presents with a feeling she cannot quite name, and is offered a treatment rather than a question, is working within the system she's been given. The question is the practitioner's responsibility. When it is not offered, the loop begins. The women who have been through the loop, who have recognized it from inside it, who have made their peace with the choices that formed it, and found their way to a different relationship with the mirror, tend to describe the process of recognition as gradual and quiet, and not always what they expected. Not a revelation, not a crisis, more like a slow coming clear, the way a window fogs and defogs, and eventually you can see through it to what was always there on the other side. Beauty ideals move. They have always moved. This is one of the things that the history of beauty makes most clearly visible, and it is a history worth knowing because it reframes the present in ways that are, ultimately, reassuring rather than alarming. The hourglass waist of the Victorian era gave way to the straight, almost boyish silhouette of the 1920s flapper. The voluptuous hourglass ideal of the 1950s, the era of Marilyn Monroe and Jane Mansfield, the full bust and the nipped waist, collapsed in the 1960s into the waifish angular minimalism of Twiggy. The lean, athletic ideal of the 1980s gave way to the waif of the 1990s, the heroin chic aesthetic that was, at the time, aspirational, and that is now recognized as having done measurable harm. The curves of the early 2000s gave way to the sculpted, volumized, filtered aesthetic of the 2010s. Each of these ideals, at its peak, felt like it would last. Each was presented not as a trend but as the natural, self-evident standard of beauty, the way women should look, the form the female body should aspire to. And each was wrong about its own permanence. The pace of these changes has been accelerating. In the 19th century, a dominant beauty ideal might persist for decades, shaped by the slow movement of painting and sculpture, and the relatively narrow circulation of fashion imagery. In the 20th century, photography and cinema and mass-market advertising sped the cycle. By the 21st century, social media had compressed the cycle to something approaching years rather than decades, with the additional twist that the new ideals were not just being depicted, but being actively produced by the same technology that distributed them. The filter created the ideal, and distributed it simultaneously, at a speed that print media could never have achieved. The relevant fact for this story is that the filler aesthetic, the plumped lips, the volumized cheeks, the lifted jawline, the overall quality of fullness that characterized the dominant beauty ideal from roughly 2015 to 2022, was itself a trend, not a timeless standard, not the endpoint of a long cultural evolution toward truth or beauty. A trend, like every trend before it, that had a beginning and will have an end. The end, or at least the beginning of the end, arrived around 2022. What happened in 2022 and into 2023 was not a single event, but a convergence of several shifts that had been building for some time. A growing body of women publicly discussing their experiences with filler complications, not the dramatic acute complications, but the slower, stranger experiences of accumulated product, of faces that had drifted from the intended result, of the moment of looking in the mirror and not quite recognizing what was looking back. High-profile influencers and celebrities announcing that they had had their filler dissolved and documenting the process in detail. A broader cultural conversation about authenticity, about filter culture, about the cost of pursuing ideals that had been created and sustained by technology, rather than by the human faces of any actual community. There was also a generational shift in the aesthetic itself, visible in the culture's arbiters of taste, the fashion industry, the beauty industry, the entertainment industry, and then visible in the wider social media environment that those arbiters influence. The 2022 to 2025 period saw the emergence of what commentators variously called natural beauty, clean aesthetics, or, in the language that circulated among younger women on the platforms, the Get It Removed movement. Skincare replaced surgery in the aspiration landscape, or at least claimed to. The skincare industry grew enormously in those years, driven partly by the genuine effectiveness of new formulations and partly by the cultural permission to want a face that was well maintained rather than significantly altered. Sunscreen was celebrated, retinol was discussed seriously, the discourse moved toward long-term health and texture and movement and the things a face does rather than only the shape that it has. Faces that moved freely, that showed expression easily, that had the texture and mobility of faces that had not been frozen or filled, these began to be celebrated in the spaces that had, just years before, celebrated their opposite. The ability to crinkle at the eyes, to move the forehead, to have the full range of expression visible in the face. This became, in the emerging aesthetic, a marker of naturalness, of authenticity, of the particular beauty that comes from being fully inhabiting one's own face. This shift was genuinely meaningful to many women, and it is worth taking seriously as something beyond merely the next trend. The argument that the natural aesthetic is just another construct, just another version of the same pressure in different clothes, has force, and it is not wrong. Any beauty standard, including the standard of naturalness, can be experienced as a demand rather than permission. A woman who has had filler and who now exists in a culture that celebrates the unfilled face may feel the pressure of the new standard as acutely as she felt the pressure of the old one. She has not escaped the regime of appearance management, she has merely moved from one room of it to another. But there is something in the specific content of the natural aesthetic that is worth distinguishing from the content of what preceded it. The filtered, filled, sculpted aesthetic of the 2000s required active intervention to achieve. It was an ideal that could not be approached without doing something to the face. The natural aesthetic, at least in its stated aspiration, is an ideal that is approached by doing less rather than more. It is reached not by adding, but by maintaining. This does not make it free of effort or expense. The skincare required to support a natural aesthetic can be extensive and costly, but it is structurally different in a way that matters for the experience of pursuing it. The woman who pursues naturalness by choosing not to have a treatment is in a different position from the woman who pursues fullness by seeking one. The first position is, in principle, available to anyone. The second position requires a specific action, a specific expenditure, a specific engagement with a practitioner and a product and a system. The shift in aesthetic currency, if it holds, changes the direction of the effort required, and that change has implications for the bodies of women who are already carrying the results of the previous direction. For women who had received substantial amounts of filler in the years of the boom, the shift in trend was an experience of a different kind. They found themselves with faces that reflected an aesthetic that had moved on, faces that bore the markers of a particular moment in beauty culture that the culture was now reconsidering. The specific look that had been, just years before, aspirational and celebrated and widely imitated had become, in the cultural conversation, associated with excess. Photographs from the height of the filler boom, photographs that had circulated widely as images of beauty and aspiration, were being shared in the new conversation as illustrations of what the trend had produced. There is a grief in this that is particular and real, and it is worth acknowledging without minimizing. A woman who had her lips filled in 2018 because that was what was beautiful, who spent years maintaining that look because it was what she saw on every platform and what her social environment rewarded, who understood herself as participating in a mainstream aesthetic practice. That woman, in 2022, found herself holding something that the culture had decided to move away from. The choice she had made in good faith, in the terms available to her at the time, had been retroactively reframed by a cultural conversation she had not authored. This is one of the particular features of the filler story that distinguishes it from the story of other beauty trends. When wide-leg jeans go out of fashion, you buy different jeans. When a particular hair colour becomes dated, you change it. The product can be replaced. The face is not so easily updated. The dissolution trend and the aesthetic shift trend were, in this way, in direct conversation with each other. The cultural tide was turning away from the filled face at the same moment that practitioners were discovering how complicated the removal of that face could be. The women caught in the middle were navigating both the cultural judgment and the clinical reality, often without the support structures that either conversation was generating. There is also a quieter version of the trend story that rarely gets told, because it involves women who chose not to dissolve, who looked at the new aesthetic conversation and, after reflection, made a different choice. Some of the women who had received significant filler during the boom years looked at the shift in cultural conversation and recognized it for what it was, another trend. They had seen the previous trend arrive and had followed it, and they had seen it depart. They were not certain that the trend replacing it was more permanent than the one it replaced. They had lived through enough cycles to be appropriately skeptical of the current moment's confidence in its own rightness. Some of them kept their filler, not because they hadn't heard the conversation, not because they were uninformed or uncritical, because they had looked at their own faces and at what the treatment had done for them specifically, and at the relationship between their appearance and their experience of being in the world, and they had decided that the treatment continued to serve them, regardless of where the cultural conversation had moved. This too is a valid response. The faces and the choices and the histories of all the women in this story belong to those women. The culture does not have a prior claim on them. What the trend story ultimately teaches, across all its iterations, is not about filler specifically. It is about the relationship between external standards and internal ones, about the degree to which the thought in the mirror is the woman's own thought, and the degree to which it is the current moment's thought operating through her. Disentangling those two things, identifying where the woman's authentic preference ends and the culture's demand begins, is one of the longer projects of a life spent in a female body. It does not resolve neatly, but it gets easier over time to hear the difference. The aesthetic backlash that emerged publicly around 2022 was more precisely a backlash against a specific aesthetic iteration, the particular version of the filled face that the boom years had normalized, rather than a rejection of cosmetic treatment itself. This distinction matters because it clarifies what changed and what did not. What changed was the dominant aesthetic ideal, the high cheekbones and pillow lips and defined jawline that had been the aspirational standard in the early social media era, became, gradually, the marker of a specific cultural moment rather than a timeless improvement. The natural face, specifically the young, naturally symmetrical, unaltered face, was re-established as the aspirational ideal, in a way that had particular consequences for the women who had been pursuing the previous standard. What did not change was the underlying pressure. The face was still a project. The standard had shifted, but the expectation that the face should meet a standard, should be managed toward an ideal, remained entirely intact. The women who had been managing their faces toward the filled ideal were now asked to manage them toward the natural ideal through the very different interventions of dissolution, treatment pauses, and the skincare routines that became the dominant cosmetic conversation in the aftermath of the filler moment. Some researchers who study body image have noted this dynamic as a consistent feature of cultural appearance norms. The specific content of the norm changes regularly, but the meta-norm, that the appearance should be actively managed toward an external ideal, persists across all the content changes. What this means in practice is that the woman who achieves the current ideal is positioned for eventual failure, because the current ideal will eventually be succeeded by a different one, and the achievement that required effort will become the thing that marks her as having been trying. The only position that is stable over the long run is a position that does not depend on meeting the current norm, that has a relationship with the face that is not organized around meeting any external standard. This is easier to describe than to achieve, and it is not fully achievable in a culture that continues to produce and transmit the norms. But it is the direction that the most settled women in this story have moved in, and it is worth knowing that the direction exists. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. In 2021, the United Kingdom government announced that it would introduce a licensing regime for practitioners who administer non-surgical cosmetic procedures, including dermal fillers. The announcement was welcomed by the professional bodies representing plastic surgeons, dermatologists, and aesthetic practitioners. It was the culmination of years of advocacy by those bodies who had been documenting the harms caused by unregulated practice and arguing for exactly this kind of framework. The new rules, when they came into force, would require practitioners to hold a license, would restrict the administration of certain procedures to appropriately trained individuals, and would create an accountability structure that had been conspicuously absent. The year the announcement was made was 2021. The year the regulations actually came into force was 2023. The gap between announcement and implementation was 2 years. The gap between the first documented harms from unregulated practice and the announcement was considerably longer, more than a decade if one counts from the early Save Face reports, more than 2 decades if one counts from the first significant advocacy for regulation that began in the early 2000s. This is how regulation works: slowly, responsively, arriving after the fact rather than before it. It is not unique to cosmetic medicine. It is the characteristic movement of legislative process in relation to fast-moving industries. The industry moves, harms accumulate, evidence is gathered, advocacy is mounted, policy is debated, and eventually a framework arrives that addresses the conditions as they were, not as they are. By the time the framework arrives, the industry has often moved again, and the framework is already partially outdated. The conditions in the UK filler market at the height of the boom were ones that had genuinely alarmed the professionals watching them. The Save Face organisation, established in 2013 to provide a register of accredited aesthetic practitioners and to document cases of cosmetic treatment gone wrong, maintained a database of adverse outcomes from non-surgical cosmetic procedures. The organisation was founded by Ashton Collins, a practitioner who had witnessed the effects of unregulated practice firsthand and who became one of the most prominent advocates for regulation in the UK. The Save Face reports from the late 2000s made for difficult reading, not because any individual case was exceptional, but because the cumulative picture was so consistent. Cases of vascular occlusion were being reported from practitioners who had administered the treatment after a weekend training course. Tissue necrosis, the death of the skin and underlying tissue when blood supply is cut off by filler placed in or near a blood vessel, was occurring in settings where there was no emergency protocol, no hyaluronidase on hand, no rapid response capacity. Vision loss was occurring because the blood vessels of the face connect, through specific anatomical pathways, to the blood supply of the retina, and because an injector who did not know those pathways in detail was an injector who could inadvertently block them. These were rare events in absolute terms. The vast majority of filler treatments resulted in no serious complications, but rare events in a market of millions of treatments a year produce a number of affected individuals that is not small, and the concentration of those complications in the least regulated part of the market was significant. The patients who suffered the most serious harms were disproportionately the patients who had gone to the cheapest practitioners, the weekend-trained injectors, the beauty salon filler offers, the pop-up clinic with a booking page on Instagram. Price and quality of practice do not map perfectly onto each other in any market, and the cosmetic filler market was no exception. There were expensive clinics with poor practitioners and inexpensive ones with excellent ones. But the correlation between cost and competence was strong enough to be significant, and the women who were most price-sensitive, who chose the cheapest option because the more expensive ones were genuinely out of reach, were also the ones most likely to be in the hands of the least well-trained. This is a pattern that appears across many healthcare markets and that represents a specific kind of inequity. The risks of a medical treatment fall most heavily on those with the least resources to mitigate them. The women who could afford to go to the plastic surgeon with 20 years of facial anatomy training were not the women receiving treatment from the therapist who had qualified last month. The distribution of risk tracked the distribution of resources in the way that it tends to in markets that have not been adequately regulated. The migration story added a different kind of inequity to this picture. Migration, the slow, cumulative, invisible phenomenon documented in the imaging literature, was not a complication that clustered in the poorly regulated part of the market. It was documented across the full range of practitioners, including experienced ones in well-regarded clinics. It was a consequence of the product's behavior in tissue, not a consequence of poor technique. The most skilled injector in the most reputable clinic was placing a product that moved, in tissue that would respond to its movement over years, in ways that the consent conversation did not routinely address. In this sense, the migration story is a more egalitarian harm than the vascular occlusion story. It affected women across the full economic range of the market, because it was inherent to the product rather than specific to the quality of practice. The woman who paid a great deal for her filler, who saw a well-trained practitioner, who had a thorough consultation, was still receiving a product that the imaging research was showing to migrate, and still not being told this in a systematic way. The contrast with how other medical injectables are regulated is instructive. Botulinum toxin, Botox, is a prescription-only medication in the United Kingdom and in most other developed jurisdictions. This means that its administration requires the involvement of a prescribing clinician, a physician, dentist, or nurse prescriber, who must assess the patient and determine that the product is appropriate for them before prescribing it. The prescription requirement creates a point of medical accountability that filler treatments, classified as a cosmetic product rather than a medical device or medicine, did not have. The regulatory classification distinction, product versus device versus medicine, has enormous practical consequences that most patients have never considered and have no reason to have considered. The classification determines who can administer the product, under what conditions, with what training, and with what accountability. A product that can be purchased and administered by anyone requires no accountability structure. A medicine that requires prescription requires at least the involvement of someone with prescribing authority. Hyaluronic acid filler sits in the product category in the UK regulatory framework, or did until the recent changes. This classification was arguably appropriate for hyaluronic acid as a cosmetic ingredient in a cream or serum. It was less clearly appropriate for hyaluronic acid in injectable form, placed into the tissues of the face by a needle, with the potential for serious complications that the injection route introduces. The regulatory gap was real, and it was maintained, not through bad faith, but through the ordinary friction between regulatory change and industry growth. The regulatory body responsible for cosmetic product safety was designed to manage topical products. Its frameworks were not built for injectables. Adapting those frameworks required political will, administrative effort, and time, and the industry was growing faster than any of those resources were being deployed. In the United States, the FDA regulates dermal fillers as medical devices, a classification that requires pre-market approval and that creates a more robust safety pathway than the UK's cosmetic product classification. But the FDA regulation governs the product, not the practitioner. Once a filler is approved, any licensed healthcare provider can administer it, and the definition of licensed healthcare provider is broad enough to include practitioners with limited training in facial anatomy. The approved products are safe in the sense that they have met the FDA's standards for safety and efficacy in controlled clinical trials. What the FDA approval does not guarantee is the quality of the hands in which the product is placed. This distinction between product safety and practitioner competence is the fundamental distinction that most consumer-facing communication about filler has failed to convey. The approved product, in the wrong hands, can produce serious harm, The approved product, even in experienced hands, has long-term tissue behaviours that were not fully understood at the time of its approval and that the consent process is not consistently addressed. The regulatory gap is closing in most jurisdictions more slowly than most practitioners and patients would prefer. The UK's new licensing framework represents real progress. Equivalent frameworks in Australia, in several European countries, and in the process of development in others represent a direction of travel that is positive. But the women who received filler during the decades when the gap was widest are living with the consequences of a regulatory environment that was not adequate to the situation. That is not their fault. It is not the individual practitioner's fault in most cases. It is the fault of a system that was not designed to manage what the market produced, and that was slower to adapt than the market was to grow. The women who navigate that system now, who sit in consultation rooms and make decisions about their own faces, do so in a slightly better regulated landscape than the one that existed a decade ago. But they still carry most of the burden of due diligence themselves. The informed patient who knows what to ask and what to look for is still the primary protection against a market that varies enormously in quality. The informed patient is a better protected patient. That is a true and important thing. It is also an inadequate substitute for a system that protects all patients, regardless of what they know. The regulatory timeline in the United Kingdom is worth following in some detail, because it represents both the achievements of the advocacy community and the pace at which regulatory systems move relative to the pace at which markets grow. The campaign for mandatory practitioner licensing in England, led by SaveFace and supported by a coalition of professional bodies, medical associations and patient advocacy groups, began in earnest around 2013 and produced its first significant legislative result a decade later. The Health and Care Act 2022 included provisions for the introduction of mandatory licensing for non-surgical cosmetic procedures in England, with the licensing requirement taking effect in 2023 and 2024 depending on the treatment category. The decade between the beginning of the campaign and the introduction of the licensing requirement was a decade in which the unregulated market continued to operate, in which the boom years happened, and in which the consequences that the campaign was arguing against continued to accumulate. Regulation arrived after the patient harm it was designed to prevent had already reached its peak. This is the typical rhythm of regulatory response to emerging harms. The harm must be sufficiently documented and sufficiently publicly visible before the regulatory system mobilizes, and the mobilization itself is slow. The filler story is not unusual in this regard. It is consistent with the pattern of every consumer safety regulation that has ever been achieved. The harm comes first, the documentation follows, the advocacy follows that, and the regulation follows after a period of institutional process that takes whatever time it takes. What can be done differently in the future is to shorten that timeline by improving the speed at which early harm signals are captured and transmitted to regulatory attention. The SaveFace database was one mechanism for doing this, and it was effective within its scope. The development of better post-market surveillance mechanisms for cosmetic treatments, equivalent to the pharmacovigilance systems that track adverse events from pharmaceutical drugs, would allow the early signals to reach the regulators more quickly and with more methodological rigour. This is a policy argument for another context, but it is worth naming here because the women whose experiences made up the harm signal deserve to know that their accounts contributed to a change that will make the same experience less likely for the women who come after them. The filler industry did not grow by accident. It grew because of a set of economic forces that were, in their own way, as powerful as the cultural forces that shaped the demand for the treatment. Understanding those forces is not a detour from the human story at the centre of this documentary. It is part of it, because the decisions women made about their faces were being made inside an economic structure that had specific interests in how those decisions went. The global medical aesthetics market, the category that includes dermal fillers, Botox, and related non-surgical treatments, was valued at approximately $11 billion in 2020. By some industry projections, it was expected to reach $20 billion or more by 2025. These are numbers from a market, not from a hospital. This is commercial activity, structured like commerce, responsive to the incentives of commerce, and shaped by the economic logic that governs all commerce. The logic of the market rewards growth. It rewards repeat business. It rewards the creation of products that require ongoing use rather than one-time purchase. The filler market, by its nature, is a market in which repeat business is built into the product. The treatment fades, the effect diminishes, and the patient returns. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural feature of a temporary product in a permanent market. The temporariness that made the product appealing to patients was also the feature that guaranteed the market its recurring revenue. This structural feature shaped everything downstream of it: the way the treatment was marketed, the way the consultation was conducted, the way the duration was communicated to patients, the way the industry thought about long-term patient management. A market that depends on return visits is a market with an inherent interest in the patient returning, and that interest is not always identical to the patient's interest in receiving only as much product as she actually needs. The investment in the filler market by pharmaceutical companies was substantial and early. The approval of Restylane in the United States in 2003 came after years of clinical development and regulatory process, representing a significant investment by the manufacturer QMed. The subsequent bidding war for the major filler brands, Allergan acquiring the Juvederm family, Galderma building the Restylane portfolio, Merz developing Bellotero, involved investments of hundreds of millions of dollars. The companies that made these investments needed returns, and the returns required growth. The growth was achieved through marketing, but it was also achieved through training. The practitioner education programs that the manufacturers funded were not primarily altruistic. They were market development, the expansion of the pool of practitioners who could administer the product, and through whom the product would reach more patients. More practitioners meant more treatments, meant more units sold, meant more revenue. The training programs were well designed and technically competent, because the manufacturers needed practitioners who could produce good results to maintain confidence in the product category. But the training also shaped the way the product was presented, and migration was not a central concern of programs designed to build a market. The structure of the clinic business created its own economic pressures. A filler clinic in the period of the boom typically operated with significant overhead: rent, equipment, insurance, staff, the cost of the product itself. Revenue depended on the number of treatments performed and on the average revenue per treatment. The economics of the clinic created a pressure toward volume, more patients, more sessions, more product per session, that was not necessarily identical to the clinical interest in conservative long-term management. The practitioner working within a clinic structure faced these pressures whether they acknowledged them explicitly or not. The practitioner who recommended conservative treatment, who suggested waiting before additional product, who noted that the tissue appeared to have existing product, and recommended imaging before proceeding. That practitioner was managing the patient's long-term interest at a potential cost to the clinic's short-term revenue. The practitioner who said yes more readily, who proposed fuller treatment plans, who made the appointment easy and the treatment comprehensive, was managing the revenue more effectively. Most practitioners are ethical, and most of them navigate this tension with appropriate professional judgment. But the tension is real, and the economic structure that creates it is worth understanding when thinking about why the migration research did not travel more quickly from the journals to the consultation rooms. There was also a particular economic dynamic that emerged with social media that is worth naming specifically: the incentive toward visible results. The before and after photograph is the currency of the aesthetic medicine social media account. It is how practitioners demonstrate their work, attract new patients, and build the reputation that drives the business. The economics of social media, the algorithm's preference for engaging content, the engagement metrics that track likes and shares and comments, create an incentive toward images that are striking, visible, and demonstrably transformative. A conservative treatment result, 0.2 of a milliliter of lip filler, resulting in a subtle improvement that would require a discerning eye to identify, does not make a compelling before and after. A more dramatic treatment result does. The economic incentive of social media marketing for a practitioner building a practice through digital channels favored the more dramatic result, not because any individual practitioner necessarily chose drama over restraint, but because the system rewarded what was visible and penalized what was subtle. The cumulative effect of this incentive, across hundreds of clinics, across thousands of social media accounts, across the years of the boom, was a visual culture within aesthetic medicine that skewed toward more, that normalized volumes that the more conservative practitioners considered excessive, and that set an aesthetic standard for potential patients based on the outcomes that were social media ready rather than the outcomes that were clinically appropriate for the individual patient. One detail from the economics of those years that tends to stay with people when they hear it: the markup on filler product. The cost of a single syringe of branded hyaluronic acid filler purchased by the clinic at the wholesale price ranged from approximately £40 to £80 sterling in the UK market in the late 2010s, depending on the brand and the volume of purchasing. The same syringe was charged to the patient at between £300 and £600, depending on the clinic and the treatment area. The markup was between 4 and 10 times the cost of the product. This is not unusual in medical services, where the overhead costs of the clinical environment justify significant margins over the cost of consumables, but it is useful context for understanding the economic structure of a consultation in which the practitioner recommends additional product or a higher volume or additional treatment areas. The financial interest of the clinic in each additional unit placed is significant, and that interest operates in the background of every consultation recommendation, even in clinics where it is managed with complete professional integrity. None of this is an argument that the industry is corrupt. It is an argument that the industry is an industry, that it's subject to the economic logic of all markets, and that the interests of the market are not always identical to the interests of the patient. This is true of all of medicine, and it is why the ethical frameworks and regulatory structures of medicine exist, to create the conditions in which professional judgment can override market incentives when the two are in conflict. In the filler market, during the years of the boom, those conditions were not always present. The ethical frameworks were incomplete. The regulatory structures were inadequate. The professional judgment of individual practitioners was the primary check on the market's incentives, and that check was variable in its effectiveness depending on the practitioner, the clinic, and the part of the market they occupied. The women who made their decisions in that environment were not making decisions in a neutral space. They were making decisions inside a market that had specific interests in those decisions, and they were not always equipped with the information that would have allowed them to identify those interests and evaluate them independently. Understanding this does not change the past. It does not undo the decisions that were made or the product that was placed, but it changes the way the responsibility for those decisions is allocated. It returns some of the weight of that responsibility to the system that created the conditions rather than placing all of it on the individual woman who was navigating the system as best she could. And understanding it, going forward, is part of what makes a more informed decision possible. The market is still a market. The incentives are still present. The economic structure of the filler industry has not fundamentally changed in ways that eliminate the pressures that shaped the boom years. What has changed is the availability of information that allows the patient to navigate those pressures with a better map. The map is here, the navigation is still yours. The financial architecture of the filler industry also shaped the information flow in a second important way, through the structure of the training certifications that practitioners sought to build credibility in the market. By the mid-2000s, a significant cottage industry of training companies had grown up alongside the main pharmaceutical company training programs. These companies offered certification courses of varying quality and duration, from intensive multi-day programs with anatomical cadaver work and supervised clinical practice, to weekend courses offering a certificate of completion after a day and a half of instruction and a practice injection on a colleague. The certificates looked similar, the training they represented was not. Patients who chose a practitioner based on the display of certifications on a clinic wall were not equipped to evaluate the quality of the training those certificates represented. The credential the patient could see was not the competence it might appear to signify. And the market for certifications, driven by practitioners seeking the credibility that credentials provided, rather than necessarily by the training that credibility should require, created an incentive structure in which the credential could be obtained without the knowledge it was supposed to demonstrate. This is not a problem unique to aesthetic medicine. It appears in many markets where credentials serve as a substitute for direct quality assessment by the consumer, and where the issuance of credentials is itself a commercial activity. But it had particular consequences in a market where the thing being certified, the competence to place a needle into the tissue of a face without causing harm, had a risk profile that the certificate was supposed to guarantee against. The women who chose their practitioner based on credentials were doing the reasonable thing, in the absence of better information. The credential system was supposed to provide assurance. The credential system did not always provide what it appeared to. Understanding this is not about identifying blame. It is about understanding the multiple layers of the system in which cosmetic treatment decisions were made, and the multiple points at which the information available to the patient was less than the decision required. The credential was one more point at which the appearance of assurance substituted for the substance of it. There were practitioners who knew and who said so. Not loudly, and not in ways that reached the mainstream conversation. But in the professional literature, in the conference presentations, in the conversations at the meetings where the most experienced people in the field talked to each other, there were voices raising concerns about cumulative filler use from quite early in the market's expansion. Understanding who those voices were and why they were not heard more widely is part of understanding the structure of the information gap. One of the earliest and most persistent was the voice of the surgical community, the plastic surgeons and facial surgeons who, by the late 2000s and early 2010s, were beginning to encounter in the operating room the consequences of years of filler use in their patients. Surgeons who perform facelifts and other facial procedures work in the deep tissue layers of the face, and they see what is there in a way that the surface viewing practitioner cannot. When they began reporting, in case presentations at surgical meetings, what they were finding in tissue they had not expected to find it in, the finding was significant. The surgical community's concerns were different in character from the concerns about immediate complications. The acute risks of filler, vascular occlusion, tissue necrosis, vision loss, had been documented and were being addressed through training and protocol development. The surgical findings were about something slower, something cumulative, something that didn't present as a complication in the way that a blocked vessel presented, but that nonetheless changed the surgical landscape in ways that mattered. A facelift is a procedure that involves lifting the skin and underlying tissue from the facial skeleton, repositioning it, and removing the excess. The surgeon navigates between the skin and the deeper structures, dissecting through the planes of tissue that make up the face. When those planes contain filler, whether from recent injections or from product that has migrated from elsewhere over years, the dissection is more complex. The filler changes the feel of the tissue. It can create adhesions between tissue layers that would normally separate cleanly. It can be present in quantities that require additional time and care to manage. The surgical reports that emerged from the late 2000s described cases that varied from the mildly inconvenient to the genuinely difficult. In some, the surgeon found small quantities of filler that were easily identified and managed without significant impact on the procedure. In others, the quantities were larger, the distribution more widespread, and the integration into the tissue more complete, requiring painstaking removal before the planned procedure could proceed, adding time and complexity that the surgical plan had not anticipated. These reports were published in the surgical journals. They were discussed at the meetings of the surgical professional bodies. They were taken seriously by the surgeons who read them. What they were less good at was crossing the professional boundary from the surgical community to the aesthetic injection community. The nurses, the therapists, the general practitioners, the dentists who made up the large majority of the practitioners performing filler treatments. The two communities, surgeons and injectors, occupied overlapping but distinct professional spaces. They had their own journals, their own conferences, their own continuing education ecosystems. Information that was salient to one did not automatically reach the other. The surgical finding of unexpected filler in the operating room was not a finding that triggered a rapid update to the training materials and consent forms of the aesthetic injection clinics. It was a finding that circulated in the surgical community and that trickled slowly into the broader conversation. There were also individual practitioners, experienced injectors, the ones who had been in the field the longest and who had followed their patients across the most years, who had developed concerns about cumulative use from their own clinical observation. These practitioners had watched their patients change over years of treatment in ways that they found troubling. They had seen the quality of the tissue change. They had seen the distribution of the result change in ways that the treatment notes didn't account for. They had developed a sense, based on long clinical experience, that something was accumulating in the tissue in ways that the prevailing understanding of the product did not describe. Some of these practitioners adjusted their own practice. became more conservative with volume, extended the intervals between sessions, were more likely to recommend a treatment pause. Some of them began to discuss migration with their patients, even before it was formally incorporated into consent guidelines. Some of them used ultrasound, in their own clinical practice, to assess the tissue before placing additional product. These practitioners existed. They were not rare. But they were not the dominant voice in a market that was growing rapidly and that rewarded volume and enthusiasm over caution. The practitioner who did less, who recommended waiting, who was willing to say that the tissue looked like it had existing product and that adding more might not be the right move. That practitioner was swimming against a current that ran strongly in the other direction. There is another set of voices that deserves attention in this story, and those are the voices of the women who experienced the complications and who tried to bring them to the attention of the system. The SaveFace database in the United Kingdom was built on the accounts of patients who had bad experiences with non-surgical cosmetic treatments and who reported them to the organisation. Those reports were used to build the advocacy case for regulation. They were shared, in appropriately anonymised form, with the relevant professional bodies and regulatory authorities. The women who contributed those accounts were doing something that required both courage and the conviction that their experience was worth being part of a record. In some cases, their accounts were received and acted on appropriately. The practitioner was investigated, removed from the register, subject to professional consequences. In others, the absence of a regulatory framework meant that there was no register to remove them from, no consequences available, no accountability structure to appeal to. The women who had experienced harm from unregulated practitioners were, in the absence of regulation, largely on their own. The experience of reporting a cosmetic treatment complication was also, for many women, complicated by the awareness that the treatment was elective, that they had chosen to have it, that the choice was in some quarters seen as frivolous or vain, and that the reporting of a complication from an elective cosmetic procedure might be received with less sympathy than the reporting of a complication from a treatment for disease. Some women chose not to report for this reason. Others who did report found that the response they received reflected this framing, that the implication in how their account was handled was that they had made a choice and were dealing with the consequences of it. This is a form of the judgment that cosmetic medicine navigates constantly, the way that the elective nature of the treatment is used, sometimes implicitly and sometimes explicitly, to reduce the weight of the patient's claim to protection. If you chose to have it, the reasoning goes, you should have been more careful. The responsibility is allocated to the chooser rather than to the system that created the conditions for the choice. That reasoning is both widespread and inadequate. It ignores the information asymmetry that governed the market. It ignores the regulatory failure that permitted unqualified practitioners to operate without consequence. It ignores the cultural normalization that made the choice feel far safer than it was. And it ignores the simple fact that the right to make an informed choice is not reduced by the fact that the choice was elective. The women who chose to have filler had the right to make that choice with accurate information, in conditions that were adequately regulated from practitioners who were appropriately trained. Many of them did not have those conditions. The elective nature of the treatment does not change that. The voices that were quieter, the surgeons, the cautious practitioners, the women who had complications and reported them, were quiet not because what they had to say was unimportant, but because the structure of the market and the culture around it created conditions in which those voices had to work against a very strong current. The current is slower now. The voices are somewhat louder. The conversation has shifted enough that what was said quietly in the journals in 2011 is now said more clearly in the consulting rooms of 2025. It took longer than it should have, most things do. There is a category of professional silence that is distinct from dishonesty, and that is worth naming precisely because it is so common in medicine and so underappreciated in its effects. Professional silence is the silence that exists not because a practitioner is concealing something they know, but because the something does not yet have a clear enough form to warrant saying. The migration research of 2009 and 2011 was real, but it was also early. Small sample sizes, imaging technologies that were not yet standard, findings that needed replication before they could be presented with confidence. A practitioner who had read those papers in 2011 and who tried to incorporate them into a consent conversation was in a difficult position. How to communicate uncertainty in a way that was neither alarmist nor dismissive, neither overstating the risk nor concealing what the research had begun to find. Most practitioners resolved this uncertainty by saying nothing, because saying nothing was easier and more professionally defensible than saying something that might be premature. If the science was not yet settled, the argument went, it was better to wait for settled science before alarming patients. This argument has a certain professional logic to it. It also meant that patients were making decisions without information that existed, because the threshold for sharing that information had been set higher than the information had yet reached. The threshold question is not a simple one. Medicine communicates risk under uncertainty constantly, and there are good reasons to be careful about how that communication is done. Uncertain information communicated poorly can produce fear without being actionable, or can create misperceptions that are harder to correct than the original uncertainty would have been to hold. These are legitimate concerns about the communication of emerging research. But the threshold also reflects professional interests that are not identical to patient interests. A finding that made the treatment look riskier was a finding that the market, and the practitioner economic interests embedded in the market, had some incentive not to rush to communicate. Not because individual practitioners were consciously calculating their interests against their patients. Most were not. But because the institutional inertia of a market that was growing, and that had significant stakeholders invested in its continued growth, meant that the path of least resistance was always to wait for more certainty before saying something that might slow the momentum. The voices that were quieter were quiet in part because the institutional structures around them were not designed to amplify what they were saying. They needed to reach a sufficient level of certainty and a sufficient level of professional consensus before the institutions would pick up the signal. That threshold took years to reach. The patients who made decisions during those years made them with the information that the institutions had decided to share, which was not the same as the information that existed. The body keeps records. Not in the way that a file is kept, or a photograph, or a letter stored in a drawer. The body keeps records in its own language, in the density of the bone and the arrangement of the scar tissue and the particular way a muscle has adapted over years to compensate for a neighbouring one that doesn't work as it used to. These records are not legible to the naked eye in most cases. They require specific instruments and specific knowledge to read. But they are there, and they are comprehensive, and they tell a story that is in some ways more accurate than any account the person who carries the body might give. The filler migration research is, in one sense, a story about what the body has been quietly recording in the tissue of the face, what the imaging instruments reveal when they are turned toward faces that have been treated for years. The record is more complicated than anyone anticipated, more distributed, more persistent, more intertwined with the body's own structures than the early understanding of the product had suggested. But the body as archive is a larger concept than any single treatment or any single substance. Every face that has lived in a body carries the record of that living in it, in the wrinkles that trace the expressions most frequently made, in the asymmetries that reflect decades of sleeping on one side, in the hollows and the fullnesses that map the gains and losses of a life lived in that particular flesh. The face is the most public part of this archive, the most visible, the most subject to the projections of others who read it. And the thing about archives is that they are not neutral documents. An archive is always curated by something, by who had access to the materials, by what was deemed worth keeping, by the conditions in which the keeping happened. The face as archive is curated by genetics and by time and by the choices that have been made about it, and all of those things leave their mark in the record. The filler is one of them, the sun damage is another, the expression lines are another, the shadows under the eyes that came with a particular chapter of insufficient sleep are another. The idea that any of these marks can be fully reversed, that the face can be returned to a previous chapter of its own archive, is one that the body does not quite support. The body moves forward, it accumulates, it adapts, it carries what has happened to it in the structures of its tissue, and it cannot be asked to forget what it knows. This is not only about filler, it is about the relationship between cosmetic intervention and time, about what it means to try to modify the archive and what the archive does with the modification. The philosophical dimension of this has been explored by thinkers working at the intersection of medicine, ethics, and the philosophy of personal identity. The question of what relationship we have with our future selves, and whether our future selves have valid claims against decisions we make now is relevant to the cosmetic medicine context in specific ways. When a woman in her 20s places filler in her tissue, she is making a decision on behalf of her 40-year-old self, the self who will eventually sit with a surgeon and discover what the tissue contains, the self who will seek to dissolve product that has been there for 15 years, the self who may find that the dissolution is less complete than the 20-year-old self would have chosen if she had known. The 20-year-old self and the 40-year-old self are different people in significant ways, and the decision made by one affects the options available to the other. This is not a reason not to make any decisions with long-term consequences. All decisions have long-term consequences. The choice to do nothing also has them. The question is whether the decision is made with the future self in view, with an awareness of what that self might want, what options they might value, what the tissue they will inherit from the current self will allow them to do. The consent conversation that included migration would have been, among other things, a way of including the future self in the decision, of bringing into the consultation room the patient who will be there in 10 years, looking at the tissue that has been accumulating product, and giving her a voice in what is decided today. She was absent from most of those consultations. Her interests were not represented. The decision was made by the present self, with the present self's information and the present self's priorities, without a clear account of what would remain in the tissue for the future self to manage. Understanding bodies as archives, as structures that accumulate rather than reset, changes the way that cosmetic decisions look in retrospect. The decision to inject is not just a decision about a moment's result. It is a decision about what the tissue will contain going forward, and what that will mean for the decisions that will be available afterward. Framed that way, the consent conversation should include a different kind of information than the one focused only on the immediate result. There is also something in the archive metaphor that is useful for the experience of women who have been through significant filler use and have come to terms with it. The archive cannot be erased. The tissue cannot be returned to a state before the treatment began. But the archive can be understood, it can be interpreted, it can be added to going forward in ways that are more informed and more consistent with what the full picture shows. The woman who has been through this and who now approaches the question of further treatment, or the question of dissolution, or the question of simply living with what she has, is approaching it from inside the archive rather than from outside it. She knows her tissue in a way that the woman booking her first appointment does not. That knowledge is not nothing. It is in fact one of the most significant resources available to her in making the next decision. The tissue is not the enemy. It is not the site of a mistake that needs to be corrected. It is the record of a life being lived, one that has had filler in it for a while, and may continue to, or may not, depending on choices that the woman herself makes with accurate information in a room where she is genuinely listened to. There is a practice in some medical traditions of listening to the body, attending to what it communicates through sensation, through comfort and discomfort, through the signals that precede named conditions by enough time to do something about them. This practice is increasingly formalized in integrative medicine, and has a long history in both Eastern and Western healing traditions. It asks that the person who inhabits the body become a careful reader of the archive it is keeping, not in an anxious, hypervigilant way, but in the attentive, curious way that good stewardship of anything requires. The body communicates, the tissue communicates. The face, which is the most visible part of the body's record, communicates in ways that the culture reads and responds to, but that the woman herself often knows most specifically. The way a particular treatment looked right for a week and then began to look different. The way a specific area of the face feels when something has changed in the tissue. The way the movement of an expression is subtly different from how it was before. These communications from the body are not always legible without practice, and the noise of the cultural conversation about faces, the constant assessment, the comparison, the pursuit of an externally defined standard, can make it hard to hear them. But they are there, and learning to hear them is part of the practice of inhabiting a body that is, inevitably, going to carry its history in its face. The archive is not finished. It continues to be written with every day that passes, with every choice that is made or not made, with every morning at the mirror and every movement of expression, and every year of living in the tissue. The story the face tells is never complete until the person behind it is, and even then it is inherited by the people who remember the face, who carry it forward in memory, in the recognizing look of someone who loved it. The thought in the mirror is one of the ways the archive speaks. It deserves to be heard. And then the morning continues. The archive metaphor opens onto a question about memory that is not only philosophical but clinical. What does the body remember that the mind has moved past? The tissue of the face carries its own memory of what has been done to it. A face that has been injected many times in a particular location develops a relationship with that location. The tissue becomes familiar with the presence of the product in a way that has physical correlates. Some researchers describe this in terms of the tissue response, the local inflammatory and adaptive processes that occur in response to foreign material, however biocompatible, that leave traces in the cellular environment even after the product itself has resolved. This is not a dramatic finding. It does not suggest that the tissue is damaged in any clinically meaningful way by repeated injection of high-quality pharmaceutical product administered correctly. What it suggests is that the tissue has a history, that the cellular environment of a face that has been treated extensively over years is not identical to the cellular environment of a face that has not been, even when the product is no longer detectable by imaging. The clinical relevance of this is still being worked out, but the conceptual relevance is immediate. The body is not a neutral medium in which a treatment is placed and removed without trace. It is a responsive, adaptive system that registers and responds to what happens to it, and whose responses accumulate in ways that cannot be fully reset. Understanding this changes the framing of the question that many women ask when they are considering dissolution, or a treatment pause. Will I be back to where I started? The honest answer, which the best practitioners now give, is not exactly. Not because anything has gone wrong, and not because the tissue is harmed, but because the body does not return to exactly where it started from any significant intervention. It carries the history of the intervention in its adaptive responses even after the product itself is gone. What this means in practice is that the face after dissolution, or after a treatment pause, is the face that this body is now, with the years of treatment included in its history, with the adaptations that the tissue has made included in its architecture. It is not a worse face. It is not a damaged face. It is the face that this specific woman is living in at this specific moment, which is the only face that was ever available for living in. The archive continues to be written. The entries from the treatment years are part of it. The entries from the years after, whatever choices are made, whatever treatments undertaken or foregone, will be added to it. The body keeps its records, and the records are yours, and they belong to a story that is not yet finished. At some point in the long arc of the filler boom, a significant number of women began to have a second thought. Not the second thought of immediate regret, that had always existed, a small and recognized complication of any cosmetic procedure, addressed in the standard protocols with the recommendation to wait 2 weeks and reassess. This was a different kind of second thought. Slower, more considered, arriving not in the days after treatment, but in the months and years after a longer pattern of treatment. The second thought of a woman who had been doing something for a while and was beginning to wonder what it was adding up to. The dissolution trend, the movement visible from about 2019 onward, of women seeking to have their filler removed rather than maintained, has been analysed from multiple angles. Cultural commentators framed it as a beauty industry backlash. Medical professionals framed it as a clinical response to overcorrection. Women who went through it framed it in a wider range of ways, and those ways are the most useful ones to attend to. Some of the women who sought dissolution were responding to a visible change in their appearance that they didn't like. The accumulated product over years of treatment had produced a result that had gradually diverged from what they had intended. A heaviness, a stiffness, a quality of not quite rightness that had crept in incrementally until it was undeniable. These women sought dissolution because the aesthetic result was no longer what they wanted, and the dissolution was, for many of them, successful in returning their faces to something closer to what they recognized as themselves. Some were responding to information they had received. The migration research, the surgical reports, the accounts of other women who had been through the same pattern and were now reassessing. These women were not necessarily unhappy with their appearance. They were responding to knowledge and to the conclusion that what they had been doing without full information deserved to be reconsidered with it. Some were responding to the cultural shift, to the new aesthetic conversation that was making the filled face look, suddenly, like something from a specific moment rather than like a timeless standard. These women may have been happy enough with their appearance before the shift, but found themselves wanting a different relationship with the cultural current once it had changed direction. And some were responding to all of these things simultaneously, in proportions that they themselves could not always clearly separate. The desire to change was overdetermined, as most significant desires are, produced by the convergence of multiple streams of motivation that cannot be neatly disentangled from each other. The experience of dissolution itself was varied, and the variation is worth knowing about because it was not always what the women who sought it had expected. Hyaluronidase dissolution is, in the hands of an experienced practitioner, an effective procedure. The enzyme is injected into the treated area, it breaks down the hyaluronic acid chains of the filler, and the product loses its structure and is absorbed. The process is rapid. Results are often visible within hours, with continued improvement over days. For recently placed filler in accessible locations, dissolution is generally highly effective. For older filler, a product that has been in the tissue for 2, 3, 5 or more years, the results are more variable. Some older product dissolves readily. Some has changed in ways that make it less responsive to the enzyme. Some has migrated to locations where it is more difficult to access. Some has integrated with the surrounding tissue structures in ways that the dissolution cannot fully unwind. And then there are the other substances. One of the complications of the filler boom that has been less prominently discussed is the fact that not all of the product placed in clinic chairs during that period was pharmaceutical-grade hyaluronic acid from reputable manufacturers. A market that was growing quickly, that attracted many new practitioners, that in some jurisdictions had no regulatory requirements for the product itself beyond being a cosmetic, also attracted substandard product. Fillers of uncertain composition, unlicensed manufacturers, products sold at significantly lower prices through channels that bypass the standard pharmaceutical supply chain. These products were not hyaluronic acid in most cases. Some were acrylamide-based. Some were non-biodegradable synthetics. Some were entirely unknown in composition to both the practitioner and the patient. The women who received them were not told they were receiving anything other than standard filler. Some of them discovered the truth only when they sought dissolution and found that the hyaluronidase had no effect. When the practitioner turned to them and said that what was in the tissue was not responding to the enzyme, and that further investigation was needed to determine what was actually there. This is a darker corner of the filler story than the migration narrative, and it is important not to conflate the two. Most of the product placed during the boom years was pharmaceutical-grade hyaluronic acid from legitimate manufacturers, and the migration story applies to that legitimate product, not only to the substandard one. But the existence of the substandard market, and its consequences for the women who received it, is part of the complete picture. For the women who went through the dissolution process and emerged from it into a face they had not previously known, the face after all the product was removed, however much was successfully removed, there was often a period of adjustment that was its own complicated experience. The face without filler for a woman who had been wearing filler for years can feel unfamiliar in a different way from the face with it. The contours that the filler had created, that had become, over time, the face she recognized as her own, were gone. What remained was the face that the years had produced in the absence of filler, including the changes that had occurred during the years when filler was masking them. Some women describe looking at themselves after dissolution and seeing, for the first time in years, the aging that had happened while the filler was in place. The filler had not stopped the aging, it had obscured it, and when it was removed, the aging was still there, the hollowing, the lines, the subtle textural changes that time produces, plus the additional effect of skin that had been stretched by the volume beneath it, and was now resting differently without it. This is not always a distressing experience. Some women describe a profound relief at seeing their own face again, the face that moves freely, that responds to expression, that is recognizable as the face they had before the filler began. The authenticity of the unaltered face had value for them that the aesthetics of the filled face had not quite compensated for, and its return was a return to something they had missed without clearly naming the missing. Others found the after-dissolution face more difficult to receive. They had expected restoration and found something that was, in some specific ways, less than what they had before the treatment began. The skin was looser, the hollows were more pronounced. The years had done what years do, and the filler, in masking them, had also prevented the gradual adaptation to them that might have happened naturally. Neither of these experiences is wrong. Both of them are real. The dissolution story, like the filler story, is one that contains multitudes, that cannot be reduced to a single verdict without losing the specific truth of individual experience. What connects the accounts of the women who dissolved and the women who didn't, the women who regret and the women who don't, is the wish, expressed in one way or another, directly or obliquely, that the decision had been made with more information. Not necessarily a different decision, possibly the same one, but made by a woman who understood the full picture, who had been given the complete account of what the product did in the tissue over time, who had made the choice knowing what she was beginning rather than only what she was immediately doing. That wish is the thing this story is trying to address, not by making the decision for anyone, not by telling anyone what they should do, but by putting the information in the room where it should have been all along. The dissolution movement also produced a secondary phenomenon that was not widely anticipated: the emergence of practitioners who specialized in the removal of filler as a distinct clinical skill. In the early years of the filler market, dissolution was understood primarily as a correction tool, something used when a treatment had gone wrong, when a vessel had been occluded and needed emergency intervention, when a result was clearly unacceptable. The skills required for dissolution were taught as part of the complication management curriculum, not as a specialty in their own right. As the demand for elective dissolution grew, driven by the combination of accumulated overcorrection, migration concerns, and the cultural turn away from the filled aesthetic, a new clinical practice emerged. Practitioners with specific expertise in assessment and dissolution attracted patients from considerable distances. They developed protocols for imaging the tissue before dissolution, for identifying the location and extent of the product to be removed, for planning the dissolution in stages where the volume was significant, for managing the expectations of patients who had hoped for a complete reset and who needed to understand the realistic scope of what was achievable. These practitioners also became, by the nature of their work, some of the most clinically informed voices in the conversation about migration. They were seeing, in the tissue of their patients, the physical evidence of what the research had described. They were encountering product in locations that the patient's treatment records did not account for. They were developing a detailed empirical picture of what years of filler accumulation looked like from the inside. Some of them began to write about what they were finding, not in advocacy publications, but in clinical journals, in the kind of case series and observational reports that built the evidentiary base for the migration conversation. They were adding their clinical experience to the imaging research and the surgical reports, creating a body of evidence that was increasingly difficult to set aside. The women who sought dissolution were, in a sense, providing the data. Their willingness to have their tissue assessed, to consent to imaging before treatment, to describe in detail their treatment histories. This information became part of the clinical record that changed the conversation. They were participants in the evidence building, even as they were seeking resolution of their own specific situations. That contribution is worth naming. The clinical knowledge that now exists about filler migration and its management was built in part on the experiences of women who came forward with their tissue and their treatment histories and allowed clinicians to see and document what was there. The better maps that now exist for practitioners and patients alike were drawn partly with their cooperation. A girl learns her face from the faces around her. Before the mirror there are the faces of the family. The mother's face is the first, and it carries everything. The way she looks at the child, the way she looks at herself, the small daily performances of getting ready that a daughter watches long before she understands what she's watching. She watches the mirror ritual, the foundation, the lipstick, the particular frown at the reflection. She watches the way her mother's hand moves across her own cheek, with a particular expression, part appraisal and part resignation. She absorbs the meaning of those rituals before she has the words to name it. There is the face of the grandmother, and what it says about time. The grandmother's face carries the years visibly, in ways that the granddaughter will eventually understand as the map of a life. But the way the grandmother relates to that map, whether she wears it with something like pride, or with discomfort, or with the particular resignation of someone who has been fighting a losing battle, is part of what the granddaughter absorbs. There are the faces of aunts and cousins and teachers and neighbours, each of them modelling something about what a female face is allowed to be, how much space it takes up, how much care it requires, how much it matters. Long before the magazine arrives, long before the phone screen, the lessons have begun. The first beauty educators are the women of the family, and they teach what they know, which is what was taught to them. Body image researchers who study the transmission of appearance concerns across generations have found, consistently, that the most significant predictor of a daughter's body image is not the media she consumes, but the relationship her mother has with her own body and appearance. The effect is not because mothers deliberately teach their daughters to be dissatisfied. It is because daughters are extraordinarily attentive observers of the people they love, and because the things we do unconsciously, the sighs at the mirror, the apologies for eating, the reflexive comparisons to other women, are as legible to a watching child as any deliberate lesson. Mothers who speak critically about their own bodies raise daughters who are more likely to speak critically about their own bodies. Mothers who comment on the appearance of other women, who make the appraisal of female faces a conversational activity, raise daughters who learn to appraise female faces, including their own. Mothers who model the behaviour of pursuing cosmetic alteration raise daughters who learn to consider cosmetic alteration as part of the toolkit of female maintenance. This finding is uncomfortable, because it places the origin of a very widespread form of suffering in a relationship that is, in most cases, one of love. The mother who looks in the mirror and sighs is not trying to teach her daughter to be unhappy with her own appearance. She's just living her life in front of the child who is always watching. But the always watching is what daughters do, and the discomfort in the mirror is what they see, and the meaning they take from it is that this is how women relate to their own faces. The inheritance of appearance concern operates at a level of specificity that can sometimes be traced through families with uncomfortable clarity. The woman who was told by her mother that she had her grandmother's nose. The woman who grew up watching her mother touch her jawline in the mirror with an expression she couldn't name. The woman whose aunts, at family gatherings, discussed who was aging well and who was not in the specific, assessing tone that announced this was a matter of consequence. These are not unusual childhoods. They are, for many women, entirely ordinary ones. The texture of normal female socialization in a culture that has always regarded the female face as a subject requiring attention and management. By the time a young woman sits in a filler consultation chair for the first time, she has typically been in preparation for that chair for most of her conscious life. The thought in the mirror was not born in adulthood. It was planted much earlier, in the small daily lessons of a childhood spent observing what women do about their faces. The filler clinic is not where the story starts. It is where the story goes when it has been running long enough to need an answer. The specific filler moment, the moment when a young woman decides to seek the treatment, is usually the collision of a long-standing background of appearance concern with a specific contemporary pressure. For the generation that came of age with social media, that pressure arrived with particular intensity and novelty. It arrived through the phone screen, through the comparison culture of the platform, through the filtered selfie and the before and after, and the tutorial that showed how to book the appointment and what to expect. There is a term in developmental psychology, the personal fable, that describes the cognitive pattern common in adolescence of believing oneself to be uniquely exempt from negative consequences that apply to others. You know that some people have bad experiences with filler. That won't happen to you because you will go to a better clinic, because you are more careful than the people in the horror story accounts, because your face and your situation are specific in ways that protect you from what happened to them. This is not stupidity. It is a developmental feature of the adolescent brain that persists into the early 20s, and it is what makes growth possible. The capacity to take risks that experience tells you others have been harmed by, because you believe, with a conviction that feels like certainty, that you are different. It is what allows young people to try things, to move away from home, to start businesses, to fall in love. It is also what makes some of them vulnerable to treatments that carry long-term risks they cannot fully conceptualize. The migration research was particularly difficult information to communicate to a young patient, because it described a slow, invisible, cumulative harm that the personal fable was specifically equipped to dismiss. You know that filler migrates in some people over time, That won't be your experience because you won't keep getting it forever, because you'll be more careful, because you'll stop when you need to. The confidence that the long-term problem will be navigated is doing the work of making the first-time decision feel safe. And it is not entirely without basis. Some people do stop. Some people do have modest conservative treatments that do not accumulate significantly. The personal fable is not always wrong. It is, on any given bet, sometimes right. What young women were told in the main, in the years of the filler boom, was what the culture had decided they needed to hear. That this was safe, that it was normal, that everyone was doing it, and that the concerns of an older generation were the product of an outdated worldview that didn't understand the modern landscape of cosmetic medicine. The dismissal of concern as generational unfamiliarity was effective, because it was partially true. The older generation did have concerns that were sometimes disproportionate to the actual risk profile of well-administered hyaluronic acid filler. The treatment, in reputable hands, at conservative volumes, for an appropriate candidate, is safe in ways that the dramatic framing of cosmetic horror stories does not always convey. The concerns of parents and grandmothers were sometimes based on outdated information, on a conflation of modern filler with the silicone disasters of previous decades, on a general unease with cosmetic practice that did not distinguish between its safer and more problematic forms. But the young woman who concluded from this that all concern was generational noise had also concluded that there was nothing to hear. The migration research was not generational anxiety. It was peer-reviewed science, accumulating quietly in the journals while the cultural conversation moved in a different direction. The concern about cumulative use was not the concern of a generation that didn't understand the modern treatment. It was the concern that the modern treatment had not yet found a way to communicate. What should a young woman have been told in those years? She should have been told that the word reversible describes a specific truth with specific limits, that hyaluronic acid can be dissolved, under most circumstances, by hyaluronidase, but that this dissolution becomes less complete over time with repeated treatments, with product that has integrated deeply into the tissue or migrated to unexpected locations. She should have been told that the research since 2009 has been documenting migration in ways that the consent conversation was not reflecting. She should have been told that the question is not just whether she's a good candidate for this treatment today, but whether she's beginning a conversation with her tissue that will look different in 10 years than it looks in 10 weeks. She should have been told to look for the practitioner who says less is more and means it, not as a sales technique, but as a clinical position grounded in years of watching what cumulative product does over time. She should have been given the questions. The system did not reliably give her the questions. But she could be given them now, any woman, at any stage of the conversation, and they would still be worth asking. The inheritance can be interrupted. The cycle of incomplete information can be broken in the middle, as well as at the beginning. That is not a small thing. There is a specific historical moment worth pausing on, because it illuminates how the inheritance of appearance concern is not only transmitted through family, but through the structures of an entire culture at a specific time. The women who came of age in the 1990s absorbed a set of messages about bodies and faces that were, by the measures of what came before and after, unusually narrow and unusually harsh. The heroin chic aesthetic of the mid-1990s, the valorization of extreme thinness, the dark circles, the wasted quality that was somehow made glamorous, coincided with the explosion of eating disorder rates in young women that researchers would spend the following 2 decades documenting. Those young women of the 1990s became the young mothers and aunts and older sisters of the women who came of age in the 2000s. They carried their own complicated relationships with their bodies into the families and social environments that shaped the next generation. The transmission of body concern across generations is not only about what is said, it is about the emotional atmosphere of a household in which a certain relationship with bodies and faces is the air. A daughter growing up in a home where the appearance of the women around her is a subject of visible preoccupation absorbs a lesson that is not spoken, but that is nonetheless received, that the face is a project to be maintained, and that the maintenance is serious and perpetual. When dermal fillers arrived as an accessible option in the 2000s and expanded dramatically in the 2010s, they arrived into families and social networks that already had this inheritance. They arrived as a tool that answered a concern that was already deeply embedded, and they arrived at a moment when the cultural amplification of that concern through social media was at its most intense. The young woman of the 2000s who sought her first filler treatment was not making a decision in a vacuum. She was making it inside a web of transmitted messages, current cultural pressures, and available technologies that together had produced the specific form of appearance concern she was experiencing. Holding an awareness that the thread of personal desire is woven through a much larger and older fabric is useful. It allows the desire to be examined with some perspective, rather than taken simply at face value. What would it mean to give young women better tools for that examination? Not to discourage the desire for cosmetic treatment. Some desires, examined carefully, remain desires, and they are valid, but to slow the process enough that the examination can happen, to create the conditions in which the thought in the mirror can be distinguished from the cultural program that has been running beneath it for years. Some practitioners who specialize in working with younger patients describe a consultation approach that builds in exactly this kind of space. They ask the patient to describe the thought as specifically as possible. Not, "I want to look better," but the specific feature, the specific quality, the specific comparison that is driving the request. They ask how long the thought has been present, and whether there was a precipitating event, a photograph, a comment, a change in circumstances, or whether the thought has simply been there for as long as the patient can remember. These questions are not therapy. They are a form of precision, the same precision that good clinical practice applies to understanding the physical parameters of a treatment, applied to understanding the psychological parameters. What is this for? What is it expected to do? Is this the right tool for this specific situation? The answers sometimes change the treatment plan, sometimes they confirm it, sometimes they open a conversation that the patient had not expected to have in a cosmetic clinic, and that turns out to be more valuable than the treatment itself. These outcomes are not measurable in before and after photographs, but they represent the kind of care that is genuinely patient-centered in the fullest sense. By the mid-2020s, the conversation in aesthetic medicine had shifted in ways that were small but significant. Professional bodies in the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States had updated their guidelines. The British College of Aesthetic Medicine and the British Association of Aesthetic Plastic Surgeons had issued position statements on filler migration, recommending that practitioners discuss the phenomenon as part of the consent process, not to alarm patients, but to give them the complete picture that good consent requires. The American Society of Plastic Surgeons had added material on cumulative filler risks to their patient education resources. Several major filler manufacturers had updated their patient information materials to include language about migration and the limitations of dissolution. None of this happened loudly. None of it produced the kind of public reckoning that the scale of the information gap perhaps warranted. It happened in the professional channels, in the specialist publications, in the documents that circulate among practitioners rather than among patients. The patient sitting in the clinic chair was not receiving these updates directly. She was receiving, if she was fortunate, the trickle-down effects of a professional conversation that was slowly becoming more honest. But for the woman sitting in a consultation room in 2024 or 2025, the landscape had shifted enough that the questions she could ask, if she knew to ask them, would produce different answers than they might have a decade before. The questions are not secret. They're available to anyone who wants them. The challenge has been that most women don't know they need to ask until after the situation that the questions would have addressed. Here is what is worth knowing, and here is what is worth asking. The first question is about the practitioner's training and experience, but the right version of it is more specific than simply asking how long they have been injecting. The specific question is about their training in facial anatomy, the three-dimensional, living anatomy of the face, not the anatomy as depicted in diagrams but as encountered in the tissue, the danger zones of facial injection, the nasolabial vessels, the infraorbital artery, the angular vessels, the branches of the superficial temporal artery are not abstractions on a chart. They are real structures in real tissue, and the distance between them and the needle varies between patients, between injection sites, and between the upper and lower layers of the tissue. The practitioner who has trained extensively in this anatomy, who can describe the danger zones in their own words, who can explain what they do differently to avoid them, who welcomes the question because it gives them an opportunity to demonstrate knowledge, is a different kind of practitioner from one who deflects toward experience and reputation, rather than toward anatomical specificity. The length of practice matters less than the depth of knowledge, and the depth of knowledge is measurable by the specificity of the answer. The second question is about volume. How much product is being proposed for this treatment, and why that amount rather than less? The practitioner who has thought carefully about this question will give a considered answer, a specific volume, with a specific rationale for why that amount is appropriate for this patient's tissue, this area, this stage of treatment. They will also be able to describe what they would observe in the result that would prompt them to add more, and what they would observe that would tell them less was sufficient. They are thinking about the outcome, not about the product. The practitioner who gives a volume figure without being able to explain the rationale, or who proposes a treatment plan that maxes out the recommended dose at the first session, is operating from a different philosophy. Not necessarily a worse one in terms of technique, but one that is less aligned with the conservative, long-term thinking that the migration research supports. The third question is the one that the migration research makes most directly relevant. What is the practitioner's approach to patients who have received filler before? Do they recommend imaging for patients with a significant treatment history? Do they ask about previous treatments in detail, including treatments performed by other practitioners? Do they have a view on how long a patient should wait before additional product is placed, and what that view is based on? The practitioner who has engaged with the migration research will have considered these questions. They may not have definitive answers to all of them. The research is still evolving, and the clinical protocols are still being refined, but they will have considered positions that reflect an awareness of the long-term picture. The practitioner who says simply that the previous product has absorbed and the tissue is ready for more without any assessment of the actual state of the tissue is making an assumption that the imaging research suggests may not be reliable. The fourth question is the emergency protocol question, and it is the one most likely to reveal the difference between a practitioner who has thought about complications and one who has not. Does the clinic stock hyaluronidase on site at all times in a quantity sufficient to treat a vascular occlusion if one occurs? What is the procedure if a patient reports vision changes during or after treatment? Is there a pathway to emergency ophthalmology, or to a practitioner trained in hyaluronidase injection for vascular compromise? A practitioner who is ready for complications is not expecting them. They are being honest about the fact that complications are possible, and that the response to them matters enormously, and that the preparation for a response that may never be needed is part of the duty of care that the treatment requires. The practitioner who says that complications don't happen with their technique, who deflects the question by minimizing the risk, is not a safer practitioner. They are an overconfident one. And the fifth question, the quietest one, the one that the patient asks herself before she asks anything else, in the time between making the appointment and walking through the door, is this: what specifically am I hoping this will change about how I feel? Not how I look, how I feel. The distinction matters because the treatment addresses the first thing directly and the second thing only sometimes. If the answer is, I hope to feel that the lines under my eyes are less deep, or that my lips are fuller in a specific way that I've thought about carefully, then the answer is the kind that the treatment is designed to address, and the conversation with the practitioner can be productive and specific. If the answer is, I hope to feel more confident or more myself or less tired by life, then the treatment may provide temporary relief of those feelings and may not address their source. That is useful to know before investing in the treatment, because it changes how the results should be evaluated and what the expectations should realistically be. The practitioner who can engage with that fifth question, who doesn't skip past it to the clinical assessment, who hears what the patient is actually hoping for and reflects it back with honesty, is offering something more valuable than the product. They are offering the kind of care that the treatment actually requires, and that the market has not always been willing to provide. The phrase that signals a clinic worth trusting in the landscape that now exists is less is more, offered not as a reassurance, not as a sales technique, but as a clinical philosophy, a genuine position on what serves the patient over time, held by someone who has seen enough patients over enough time to know what the alternative produces. Find the practitioner who says this and means it, who will suggest a smaller volume and reassess, rather than proposing the maximum and providing it, who will note that the tissue looks like it has existing product and ask about the history before proceeding, who will recommend waiting or imaging or doing nothing at all when any of those is the right answer for the specific patient in front of them. That practitioner is harder to find on social media because their results are subtler. They are easier to find through the professional registries, through the recommendations of medical colleagues, through the recommendation of the patient who has been going to them for 10 years, and whose face has changed only as her face would have changed, gently over time, with grace. They are worth finding. They have always been worth finding. The information that was missing for so long, the research, the questions, the honest conversation about what the product does over time, is now available. What was missing is now findable. That changes nothing about the past, and it changes everything about what is possible now. It is worth dwelling for a moment on what the phrase less is more actually means in clinical practice, because in the context of filler medicine, it carries a more specific technical content than it might appear to. Volume in filler medicine is cumulative. Each session adds to the total volume of product in the tissue, not only the product from that session, but all the product that has not fully resolved from previous sessions, and all the product that has migrated from previous sessions to new locations. The practitioner who sees only the current session sees only a fraction of the total picture. The practitioner who thinks in terms of cumulative volume, who is asking not just what am I placing today, but what's the total burden of product in this tissue, is practicing the kind of medicine that the migration research supports. A conservative approach to cumulative volume means, in practice, starting with less product than the maximum and waiting to evaluate before adding more. It means extending the interval between sessions where the tissue appears to still contain product from a previous session. It means being willing to say that the aesthetic goal of the treatment can be approached more gradually, over multiple sessions, across a longer period, rather than being pursued aggressively in any given appointment. This approach produces less dramatic individual results. It does not produce the kind of before and after images that circulate widely. It produces, over time, results that are more consistent with the natural architecture of the face, results that change the face less than they preserve it, that add without overriding, that work with the tissue rather than asking the tissue to accommodate more than it can comfortably hold. The practitioners who operate this way are not all in the same demographic or the same career stage. Some are highly experienced surgeons who have seen the consequences of more aggressive approaches in the operating room. Some are nurses with years of injecting experience who have watched their long-term patients change in ways they found concerning and adjusted their practice in response. Some are newer practitioners who trained under someone who instilled the conservative philosophy from the beginning. What they share is the willingness to be guided by the tissue rather than by the appointment schedule, to let the clinical picture in front of them determine the treatment rather than a predetermined volume or a patient expectation that was set by a social media image. Finding such a practitioner may require more effort than booking the nearest available appointment online. It may require asking questions that feel uncomfortable, or visiting more than one clinic before committing to a treatment. It may require paying more for the consultation than the treatment eventually costs, because the consultation is where the value is, but the face has years ahead of it. And the decisions made in the consultation room today shape the options available in the consultation room in 5 years, and 10, and 20. The investment in the right practitioner at the beginning of that timeline is not a luxury. It is the most important cosmetic decision a person can make. There is one more resource worth naming, and it is the community of women who have been through the experience and are willing to discuss it. The online communities that formed in the years of the filler boom, and that expanded and deepened as the dissolution trend created a new set of shared experiences, represent an unusual kind of collective knowledge. They are crowdsourced clinical experience, compiled not in journals but in forums and comment sections and social media threads, by women who have had the treatments and observed the results over years and who are willing to share what they learned. This knowledge is imperfect in the ways that all anecdotal knowledge is imperfect. It is not controlled, it is not representative. It can be distorted by the selection effects of who chooses to share and what they choose to share. But it is also immediate, specific, and experiential in ways that clinical literature cannot be. The woman who describes, in a forum post, what happened when she asked her practitioner the questions above, what the answer was, what it told her, what she did next, is providing information that changes the experience of the next woman who reads it. This is, in its own way, the making of better maps. The community knowledge is part of the information landscape that a woman navigating the current moment can draw on. It sits alongside the clinical research and the updated consent guidelines and the professional registries, not replacing any of those, but adding to them the dimension of lived experience that only the patients themselves can supply. There is no clean ending to this kind of story. The face does not return to a before. The before does not exist, it never quite did, because the before was also a face in time, marked by whatever that time carried, and the time has moved since then. What there is instead is the face as it is, whatever it has accumulated, whatever it has lost, whatever the years have done to it, and whatever the choices have done to it, and the relationship between that face and the woman who inhabits it. That relationship is the only one worth attending to in the end, not the relationship between the face and the culture's current ideal, not the relationship between the face and the photograph from 10 years ago, not the relationship between the face and what the clinic can offer, the relationship between the face and the woman. The women who have been through the most of this story, who have sat in the consultation chair and said yes, and then sat in another chair years later and said now what, often describe a change in their relationship with their own face that is difficult to characterize as either loss or gain. It is something more like a reckoning or a settlement, a coming to terms that is not resignation but something more active, a decision to stop treating the face as a project and start treating it as a companion that has been with you through a great deal. The face you have is the one that has been with you through everything. It held the expression of your first love, and the expression of grief, and the expression of the laugh that surprised you with how freely it arrived. It has been photographed from every angle and in every light. It has been looked at by everyone you have ever been close to, and it has been familiar to them in ways you cannot fully know, because you have only ever seen it reversed in the mirror, which is never quite the way they see it. To them it is your face, the face they recognize you by, the face that carries the particular combination of features that add up to you. To you it is always slightly other. The face you approach through glass in reversed form, in the imperfect medium of reflection. The face you have is the face of someone who has lived. That is not a consolation prize. That is the most specific thing that can be said about a face, the most individual, the most unrepeatable. Every face that has lived a life is the record of that life, and no two records look the same. This sounds like consolation, and it is not quite that. The feeling of coming home to the body after a long and complicated relationship with its appearance is not simply the discovery that it was fine all along. It is more specific than that. It is the understanding, arrived at through experience rather than through argument, that the thought in the mirror, the one that has been there since girlhood, that says not quite, is a thought that can be heard without being obeyed, that it does not require action to be honoured, that it can simply be acknowledged and then set aside, and then the mourning can proceed. Body image researchers use a term for this, body neutrality, that has begun to supplement, in some clinical contexts, the more demanding concept of body positivity. Body positivity, as it emerged in cultural discourse, asked women to celebrate their bodies, to find them beautiful, to resist the cultural pressures toward modification by replacing them with affirmation. The intention was good, and the impulse was right. But for many women, particularly those with long histories of appearance dissatisfaction, the demand to feel positive about one's body felt like another demand, another way in which the feelings they were actually having were being told they should be different. Body neutrality asks less. It asks not for celebration but for a kind of truce, the acknowledgement that the body is there, that it functions, that it carries you through the world, and that its primary job is not to be beautiful but to be alive. From that position, choices about appearance become choices rather than imperatives, things you might do or not do based on your own values and preferences, rather than responses to a demand that comes from outside. The body image researcher Renee Engeln, whose work on what she calls beauty sickness documents the cost of excessive preoccupation with appearance, argues that the hours spent attending to the mirror, considering, comparing, adjusting, evaluating, are hours not available for the rest of living. The time cost of appearance concern is real, and it tends to compound over a life. The years spent wishing for a different face are years not spent fully inhabiting the face you have. That accounting is not intended as judgment. It is intended as an observation about what is lost and what might be recovered, about the reallocation that is available when the relationship with the mirror becomes less effortful. One of the specific things that the migration story has given many women is a different relationship with the impulse to have more treatment. Not because the story is frightening, it is not, or not primarily, but because it makes the long-term picture visible in a way that the short-term framing of the individual session does not. When a woman understands that the product she's considering placing in her tissue has a history in that tissue that extends beyond the 6 to 12-month clinical duration, when she understands that what she is adding is going into a context of what has been added before, and that the two are not separable in the way the session-by-session framing suggests, she is making a different kind of decision, a more informed one that takes the long view. The long view is not always the view that declines treatment. For many women, the long view confirms the decision to have the treatment, with the right practitioner, at the right volume, for the right reason. The information about migration does not make all filler decisions wrong. It makes them more complete. And a more complete decision is a more genuinely autonomous one. A choice made by a woman who has the full picture, rather than a choice made in the space that the incomplete picture created. There is a quality to the relationship with the body that many women describe arriving at in the years after they have come through something, after the accumulation and the decision, and the dissolving or the keeping, after the period of complicated feelings, after the slow processing of what the experience taught them. The quality is hard to name precisely. It is something like settledness, the sense that the face is yours, with all that it contains and all that it has been through, and that the relationship with it is yours too. Not perfect, not without difficulty, but grounded in something more solid than the shifting standards of the current cultural moment. Getting to that settledness is not a destination that arrives all at once. It is a direction, and the direction toward a relationship with the body that is honest, specific, and based on an accurate understanding of what the body actually is available at any point in the journey. It does not require having made the right decisions before. It does not require having avoided the complications. It requires only the willingness to see the body as it actually is, rather than as it was or as the culture wishes it to be. The face in the mirror is yours. That is the only fact that is permanent. Everything else is negotiable and in flux and subject to time and choice and the slow movement of things. But the face is yours, and it has always been yours, and it will remain yours through everything that comes next. The early morning is still early, the light is still thin, something has settled. You are still at the mirror, or you have turned away from it, or you have set it down entirely and moved toward the part of the morning that has nothing to do with looking. All of those are right. The mirror is a tool, not a truth. The truth is elsewhere, in the day that is beginning, in the life that the face is there to carry you through. The concept of body neutrality is not the only frame that women who have come through this story use for their experience. Some use the language of body positivity, holding on to its insistence that the body as it is deserves affirmation and even celebration. Some use no particular frame at all, arriving at a working peace with their own appearance through the accumulation of time and experience, rather than through any articulated philosophy. But what most of them describe, in one way or another, is a shift in the quality of their attention to their own face, from the kind of attention that evaluates and finds wanting, to the kind that observes without judgment, from the attention that compares to other faces, to previous versions of its own face, to the face as it appears filtered, to the attention that simply sees what is there. This shift in attention is not achieved once and maintained forever. It is achieved, lost, recovered, lost again, in the ordinary fluctuations of a life that includes mirrors and photographs and the company of other people who have their own relationships with appearance. The good days are the days when the attention is observing. The difficult days are the days when the evaluation is running. What changes over time for most women who have done the slow work of this kind of settledness is the ratio. The observing days become more frequent. The evaluating days become less exhausting. The thought in the mirror can be heard without producing the full charge of urgency that it once produced. That is not nothing. For some women it is everything. The body image researcher Linda Smolak has argued that the endpoint of successful body image work is not the absence of negative thoughts about the body, but the development of the capacity to notice those thoughts without acting on them. The thought comes, the not quite, the this could be different, the comparison to some standard the woman has absorbed, and she notices it, and she does not immediately structure her day around addressing it. The thought arrives and passes like weather without becoming the dominant feature of the landscape. That capacity is learnable. It is not a matter of willpower or personality or the particular good fortune of having grown up in a culture that did not systematically criticize female faces. It is something that can be developed through practice and through the slow accretion of experiences that demonstrate its possibility. The women who have been through the filler story in all its forms are in some ways particularly well positioned to develop that capacity. They have had the experience of changing their faces and observing what changed and what did not. They have had the experience of the thought recurring despite the change. They have had the experience of the change fading and the thought surviving. These experiences, held with attention and honesty, provide a specific kind of evidence that the thought in the mirror is not describing a fixable problem. It is describing a relationship that needs to be navigated differently. The navigation is not a destination. The morning at the mirror is a recurring occasion, not a one-time test. But the more times the occasion is navigated with a little more ease, a little less urgency, a little more willingness to simply see what is there, the more the ease becomes available and the urgency loses some of its charge. The thin morning light is still coming through the window. The house is still quiet. The face in the mirror is still there. The face that has been through things, that is carrying what it carries, that will continue to change as it has always changed and will always change. The thought may still come. Most mornings it will come. The invitation is to let it come and to let it pass and to notice that the morning continues either way. There is a quality that the women in this story share, the ones who have come through it to the other side, and it is not the quality you might expect. It is not bitterness, though bitterness was available and understandable and true in its own way in the early stages of understanding. The gap between what they had been told and what the fuller picture showed was a real gap, and the feeling of having been left without information that was yours to have is a real feeling, and neither of those things dissolved quickly or entirely. But the women who have spent years living with their own experience of this story, who have looked at it from close up and from a distance, who have made their peace with their own choices and with the system that shaped the conditions for those choices, tend to describe something different from bitterness, something more like clarity, and clarity, unlike bitterness, is useful. Clarity about what they would do differently, clarity about what they would have wanted to know, clarity about the questions worth asking and the signs worth watching for, and the practitioners worth trusting and the ones worth walking away from. Clarity about the distinction between wanting to change and needing to change, between the considered preference for a particular result and the driven, recurring, unfillable need that was never going to be addressed by anything the needle could offer. Clarity about the relationship between the face in the mirror and the life being lived behind it. What would they carry forward if they could carry it to the younger woman at the beginning of the story, the one who is standing at the mirror in the early light, with the thought that says not quite, and who is beginning to wonder what to do about it? They would carry the knowledge that the thought in the mirror is not a problem to be solved. It is a signal to be heard and then considered carefully, considered more carefully than the industry, in the years of the boom, ever invited women to consider it. Sit with the thought a little longer before you act on it, they would say. Not forever, not in some paralysed, anxious sitting. Just long enough to get underneath it and find out what it is actually about. The thought that says not quite is worth understanding before it is worth answering. They would carry the question, what specifically am I hoping this will change about how I feel? Not how I look, how I feel. And is that something that this treatment at this volume with this practitioner is likely to address? If the answer is clear and specific, if the feeling is tied to a specific feature and the hope is tied to a specific change, then the conversation with a good practitioner is a reasonable one to have. If the answer is broader than that, if the feeling is about being invisible or unloved or out of step with who you know yourself to be, then that feeling deserves a different kind of attention first. They would carry the understanding that reversible is a real word with real limits, that the product placed in the tissue does not simply count down to 0 and disappear, that the tissue has a relationship with what is placed in it that extends beyond the clinical duration figure, that the 6 to 12 month number on the packaging describes when you will likely notice the effect has faded, not when the product has gone, that the difference between these two things matters, and that knowing the difference is the beginning of making a genuinely informed decision. They would carry the recommendation: find a practitioner who will tell you no, who will reduce the volume, who will suggest you wait, who will look at the treatment plan and say this is more than you need right now. The practitioners who do this are not cautious because they are less skilled. They are cautious because they have seen the long-term picture and they are taking it seriously. The practitioner who starts from less and evaluates before adding more is serving you differently from the one who starts from more and assesses afterward. They would carry the permission to change your mind, to dissolve if you want to dissolve, to keep what you have if you want to keep it, to do neither and simply allow the body to continue its own processes, knowing that what is in the tissue will change over time in the body's own way, and that the face that results from all those processes layered together is the face you actually have. The permission to change your mind is always yours. The permission to not change anything is also yours. What was sometimes obscured in the consultation room, in the language of the treatment and the brochure and the before and after, was the degree to which the choice was always genuinely the patient's to make and unmake. They would carry this: the understanding that the women who have been through this are not the women who made mistakes. They are the women who made decisions in the context available to them, with the information they were given, in a culture that was telling them specific things about what they should want and what was available to them and how routine and simple and reversible the wanting and the having of it was. Those women are not cautionary tales. They are people who navigated a complicated landscape with the maps they were given, and who are now, in many cases, making better maps for the people coming after them. The making of better maps is what this is. The conversation that is happening now, in the professional journals and the informed consent updates, and the regulatory changes and the public accounts of women who have been through the experience and chosen to share it, is the making of better maps. The maps are imperfect. They are incomplete. They will be revised as the research continues, but they are more accurate than what was available in 2011, or in 2015, or in 2018, and the women who use them will make more complete decisions than the women who came before them. The face of a woman who has lived carries everything. It carries the early mornings and the uncertain hours and the choices made and the ones deferred. It carries the places she loved and the ones she never quite left. It carries the years before the mirror and the years at the mirror and whatever comes after the mirror. The years in which the mirror is just a mirror, a piece of glass in a frame, something for checking whether your collar is straight before you go out into the day. Getting to that relationship with the mirror is not a destination. It is a direction. A gradual, imperfect, sometimes circling movement toward a simpler morning, toward the quick glance, the acceptable result, the moving on. Not perfect acceptance, not triumphant self-love. Something more ordinary than either of those, the quiet, sufficient recognition that the face is there and that it is yours and that the day is waiting. The women who have gone through this story know that the moving on is possible, not because everything was fine, or because the choices were without consequence, or because the information gap didn't matter. It did matter. It still matters. The consequences were real, and the gap was real, and the system that produced the gap still has a long way to go before it can be called adequate. But because the face is resilient and the woman wearing it more so, and the life being lived in that face is the point. The culture will keep having opinions about women's faces. It has never done otherwise. The trend will keep moving, and the ideal will keep shifting, and the technology will keep producing new iterations of the filtered, the altered, the processed into something closer to a standard that existed first on a screen and then in tissue. And women will keep standing at mirrors in the early morning before the house is awake, looking at their own faces in the light that is still deciding whether to be morning. What they find there will be what it has always been, a face that is theirs, in a light that is changing, with a thought that is asking to be heard. The choice every morning is what to do with the hearing. Most mornings the answer is go make some tea. The face will still be there when you get back. It always is. The woman who made the choice and the woman who is making sense of it are often in this story the same woman, separated by time and by what time has brought with it. The earlier self made the decision she had access to. The later self has more information, more perspective, more years of living in the body that carried the decision forward. The relationship between those two selves is not one of mistaken regret, or not only that. It is the ordinary relationship between any earlier and later chapter of a person, the earlier chapter making its choices with what it has, and the later chapter carrying those choices forward with what it has since acquired. This is what living in a body over time looks like. It is not a series of optimal decisions. It is a series of decisions made under conditions, of knowledge and culture and social pressure and economic structure and the particular moment in the history of an industry and a technology that the decision maker could only partly see and could not fully evaluate. The decisions that look, in retrospect, like they should have been made differently, almost always looked, at the time, like they were being made with the best available information. The grace that the later self extends to the earlier one is part of what makes it possible to make the next decision with more openness. If the earlier self is condemned for what she could not know, the later self has no permission to be imperfect either, and the later self is imperfect too, making decisions now under conditions she can only partly see. The same grace that is extended backward to the earlier self is the grace that makes it possible to make the next decision without paralysis. What the women in this story would carry forward, in addition to everything named earlier, is this: the understanding that the story is not over, that the face will continue to change, that the choices available going forward, about filler, about dissolution, about any of the other treatments that the cosmetic medicine landscape offers, will be made with more information than the earlier choices were made with. That more information does not guarantee better outcomes, but it changes the quality of the agency with which the choice is made. And in the making of an informed choice, freely made with the full picture in view, there is something that resembles dignity, the specific dignity of being a person who is fully participating in the decisions about her own body, rather than a person who has been moved through those decisions by a system that had interests other than hers. The dignified choice and the right choice are not always the same thing, but the dignified choice is always better than the uninformed one, because it is the one that the person actually made, not the one the market made for her, or the culture made for her, or the incomplete consultation made for her, hers. The thought in the mirror will return tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Most mornings the dignified response is simply, "I see you, and now the day." You are in the mirror again. The light through the window is the first thin kind, the light that arrives before the sun, before the colour, before the world has committed to being fully day. The house is quiet. The street outside holds only the particular silence of the hour before movement begins. Something has settled. Not everything. The question in the mirror doesn't entirely resolve, and maybe it isn't supposed to, but something has found its resting place, the way things do at the end of a long, slow night of listening. You have spent some hours with something true about the world, about women and the decisions they make about their own faces, and about what they were told and what they weren't, and about the slow, patient work of coming back to a body that has been through something and is still here. The face in the mirror is yours. Whatever it carries, whatever was put into it or taken from it, whatever the years have done and whatever choices have marked it, it is yours. That is not a small thing. The window is letting in the light now. Not much, just the suggestion of it. A thinning of the dark, a softening at the edges of the room, the kind of light that doesn't ask anything of you yet. You can let yourself rest here for a while. The story's done. The night has been good company, and the morning, when it comes fully, will find you just where you are. Sleep well. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. Have you ever made a choice about your own appearance that you later understood differently? And what did that understanding give you?